The FBI is making a report on a meeting that took place in New York City in a private home, but it was the meeting of a secret government committee. Participants in the meeting were given a talk. It was a presentation by two people from the CIA on hypnotic suggestion. The thing to note here is that these are two technical people from an intelligence agency talking to other people about their desire to basically perfect the ability to erase memories and implant false memories. That is their goal. Now imagine what an intelligence agency could do with that. Well, this is what they did, and this is generally what those agencies do. They don't become your friend. They don't love you. They use you. And you're useful to them so long as you are useful. And when you're not, you will be discarded.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the show. Quick reminder that if you guys do enjoy this episode, be sure to hit that subscribe button and like button below. Or if you're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, make sure to follow the show and leave us a 5-star review. Thank you. So let me ask, do you believe in coincidences?
Well, it all depends on what you mean by coincidence. And usually that's used in the same sense as an accident. Now, an accident is something that just, you trip, right, on a rug going down the stairs, all right? That's an accident. It's a slight miscalculation. A coincidence really just means that two things are related in time. Most often that they are coincident with each other. Now, that can be an accident. I mean, as you and I are sitting here talking, there are all kinds of things going on around us that are happening at the same time. They're completely unconnected, probably, to what it is that we're doing. So the fact that there is a kind of temporal relationship between something, that things happen at the same time, or in other words, doesn't prove that there's any further connection, but it can. And, I think there's an old saying is that, one time is an accident, twice is a coincidence, and 3 times is enemy action. Mm-hmm. That's a good guide to go by in this case. A coincidence can be an accident, or it can be something more deliberate. It can be a sign of some other connection between things that isn't overly apparent. Gets into that similar term like synchronicity. Comes a bit closer to this. And, from time to time, I don't think there's anything unusual about this. I've had they're not unnerving. They're just oddly disquieting incidents of synchronicity that pop up. And they're always difficult to describe. But, a juxtaposition of things, I don't know, there's some line out of the movie Repo Man. There we go. to paraphrase it, you're thinking about shrimp, and then out of the blue, somebody says shrimp or a plate of shrimp. Mm-hmm. That these things will suddenly, and in a way which is, it intuitively that this isn't entirely accidental. But you can never figure out why that's the case. So one of the places that I visit from time to time is Pasadena, down near LA. Pasadena is a kind of unique place of its own. So I visit Pasadena from time to time, and one of the people that I'm interested in, one of my research fixations, is Jack Parsons. American rocket scientist, occultist, follower of Aleister Crowley. Very interesting guy in a lot of ways. And of course, he's from Pasadena. Pasadena's Parsonstown. And that's where the JPL, Jack Parsons Lab, is located. Almost every time I go there, there's some sort of weird Parsons synchronicity that comes up. And I'll just give you one example. I go, somebody else books me into a hotel. Like you did. Okay, so I didn't pick this place, and I just go there, and I go up to the floor, and I open the window of my room, and directly across the street is this large sign that says Parsons. Now, that's Parsons Corporation. That has no connections to him, but it's the same name. That's just, and one of the things that I'm supposed to talk about when I'm there is Jack Parsons, and then open the window and Parsons. Make of that what you will. Mm-hmm. I don't know what's going on.
This is probably a good opportunity to jump into and briefly mention it there, but the idea of the occult, more specifically, I mean, from my understanding of it, that is something that's kind of an aspect of the occult and the understanding of there's a bit of a higher power. Could you maybe detail your definition?
Talking about coincidence. So if you get into what could be roughly called, and I mean roughly, occult theory, the way that things work, and a sort of, let's go back to a basic definition here. Always have to have that. What are we talking about? The term occult means hidden. It basically means hidden from sight. And it is a rough reference to the concept of a larger hidden world full of powers and influences that we can't see, but which influence us in some way. The sense that our reality is limited, it's a smaller scope, and that there is a larger one, and therefore very roughly what practitioners of the occult, what occultism tries to do is to access that larger world, to bring its power into this one, or to, help you in whatever you want to have. So within occult philosophy, I guess that's one way to put it, there are no coincidences. It sometimes can be described as magical thinking. And in that sense, everything that happens is an omen. Everything. Smallest thing that happens is an omen in the sense that it's a prediction of what else is going to happen. Now, that's a kind of interesting mindset. And it's very different than the one that most of us have every day, in which we just sort of accept all the kind of random things to happen to us. It's just sort of random things that happen to us. Now, you can think about that another way, that there are no random things. Everything that happens is an omen of something else. There are no coincidences. It's all a kind of play which is being acted out, and you, of course, are the central character in this. So there's significance in everything. And that's an interesting thing to kind of play around with. Now it requires a lot of attention. You have to start thinking about things. I've tried this for limited periods of time. It's exhausting, because it means that you have to constantly be thinking about everything that's going on. So some little thing you get out of bed in the morning, and the first thing that happens is you go down and you fix coffee and you spill it. What does that mean? Is that an omen? Okay, you should pay attention to that. And as one person who considered them an occultist put it to me, is that you need to pay it. All it's about is paying attention to what's going on around you, and realizing that, okay, you go out for the morning walk with your dog, and there's a crow following you. Okay, it was one of the things that I was told once. Always pay careful attention to crows. They're never there accidentally. Mm-hmm. Okay, watch them. Okay, because they're right. So the world, in this view, is always talking to you. There's always this communication which is going on, and you're not listening. So part of this awareness of synchronicity, or the awareness that everything is an omen of something else, is simply paying attention to what's going on. Because you're always getting some kind of clues of what's happening, some kind of prediction of what's going to take place, other things. The whole temper and mood of what's going on around you, and that's what you need to be sensitive to. And it does require you to pay attention to it, and then not just pay attention to it, but to think about how that goes together. Now, if if you're at work, that's kind of difficult to do because you've got other things to think. Again, it's exhausting and it's distracting. And I guess if you're a wizard, if you're Gandalf, you can afford to do that all day long. Most people cannot. But it is, if simply as a kind of brief experiment, sort of interesting to do. So the next time you're out for a walk, pay attention in a different way. Watch and listen. And the same guy once told me, he goes, well, if sometimes you want to have an interesting experience, go out somewhere and go out into the woods, I don't know, the middle of the desert. Deserts are always good. And kind of prepare yourself for this and just go out and sit down, take a few deep breaths, and say out loud, show me something. And then wait. And something will be, now, maybe it's just going to be a grasshopper. I mean, you can make this up any way you want, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe it will be something else. But he goes, you got to be, you have to be kind of careful about that because you've just kind of opened the door when you do that. Show me something. What do you want to be shown? You'll have no control over that. So it may be something that seems to be entirely insignificant, but pay attention to the next thing that occurs because they just showed you something.
God, there's a lot of directions to go with that. I guess, what do you think makes occultism so attractive or powerful for those in intelligence fields or in pseudo-secret societies? Because there always seems to be some level of blending, whether it's outright full-on moving in that direction or at least some useful aspects of it being integrated. What do you think makes it just such an attractive tool for those in kind of those areas?
What makes it attractive? It might work. There might be something to it. The other goal occultism is one of these terms that's thrown around very loosely, and I'm using it kind of loosely. Because there is the occult, the hidden world, the hidden powers, if you want to put it that way. And then there's occultism, which somehow implies there's some whole whenever we attach that suffix ism to something, we've just argued that it's some kind of coherent philosophy. Mm-hmm. It's some sort of set of ideas. So watch how you do that, because when you add ism to something, you've almost ennobled it in some way. You have perhaps made it more important than it actually is. You've almost created this kind of science of this. It's like anti-Semitism, which is a word I dislike for a lot of reasons because it doesn't describe exactly what it's saying. But it also sort of, and the anti-Semite who came up with the term to replace Jew hate, which is what the term was, because he thought that didn't sound sophisticated enough.
Yeah.
So he created anti-Semitism. So you no longer use the term Jew, okay, and that now it's an ism. See, it's a science. So within this, qualifying the term in that way, here's the guy I knew was going to come into this conversation early on, Aleister Crowley, because you mentioned the word occult, and the next two words are Aleister Crowley. Mm-hmm. All right. So Aleister Crowley gave his definition of magic, and within occultism, magic is the kind of basic system that you would use. It's kind of applied occultism. Maybe that's one way of thinking. There are occultists out there who hate that description, but okay, it's mine. He said, magic, I'm paraphrasing, but I think I get it close to right, is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. Mind over matter in a very simple form, not a little bit more than that. But what that suggests is that reality is malleable, that you can alter reality, your perception of it, and by altering reality, you can alter outcomes. You can shape the future. You can make it go in the direction that you want it to go. That sounds like a fairly fantastic idea, although in some ways, here's a way it was once explained to me, is that there's we'll call it the luck plane, okay? And the luck plane is normally completely, because luck is never luck, but the luck plane is like a very flat, perfectly level table. So that if I go and I put a marble in the middle of that table, it won't go anywhere. But if you can tilt that table, even the slightest degree, the marble will begin to roll. And if you can control the tilt a little bit, you can actually make the marble roll in a particular direction. You can begin to control. So the idea would be is that the level table with the marble sitting in the middle of it not moving is what we would normally think of reality. It's stable. It doesn't change. It's fixed. It's solid, just like the wall. But if you can just budget the slightest amount, you can begin to control the course. You can make the marble go where you want. You can even make it fall off of the table. Now that would be a wonderful, tremendous, that would be the greatest skill of all time if you could begin to manipulate reality in the sense that you couldn't just manipulate how you and others perceive reality, to make change occur in conformity with will, but also begin to push future events, to alter the future, or by altering the present, alter the future in some direction you want. So that's what you're ultimately kind of aiming to do, to cause change to occur in conformity with will. And again, even if you could only do that in the slightest form, you would have a tremendous advantage. It's like the thing that people always want to do is to see into the future. That's the oldest con, I think, that's been, because there are people who pretend they can do it. Usually they can't. Maybe sometimes they can. Doesn't seem to work very well because I've never seen that people are very good at predicting the future. Whatever we think, that's the one thing that you can be sure of is whatever predictions you get about the future are not going to be correct. Well, because there are lots of marbles on that table. There aren't just one, and we only see a part of what's going on. So what if you could do that? What if Crowley is correct? And what exactly is he talking about? Now, one of the things that's fairly popular today is the concept of manifesting. Heard of that? We're going to manifest. Well, that's magic. That's kind of what he's talking about, a simplified form of it. Now, you can change yourself. If you imagine success, then you will become successful. You have to have confidence in the way the future is going to unfold, and by projecting your desires in some particularly mentally or psychically forceful way, you're going to make that happen. People believe that all the time. That's why they stand and look at themselves in the mirror and give themselves a pep talk, because that's going to change things. That's a very simple form of it, but what if that works? I'm not sure that it does. I've never been able to make the future go that I wanted it to do, and God knows that I've tried on some occasions. I've certainly wished for things to happen. So is it all a matter of technique? Does it also involve some other sort of, is it always up to you? Is it up to there greater powers that exist in that hidden world that can help you do this? Is it their aid that you have to access? And why should they help you? I mean, that's always one of those things to consider if you're really wishing for something to happen, or even in some cases, if you're praying, is that why should they help you? Well, because they're good, kind, and have your best interests at heart, possibly, but, you know.
Almighty power, probably.
Almighty power. What if it's not an almighty power? What if it's just kind of a mighty power in some way? So why should they? Well, because there's some kind of quid pro quo. And then that gets you into the idea that, well, to get something, you have to give something. You know, there's no free lunch. Mm-hmm. Nothing comes without a cost. That, I think, is something, you know, we can all pretty much admit. Anything you do always involves some kind of cost. If you like to go freehand rock climbing, okay, that cost will eventually be you'll fall, okay, because eventually that will happen. Maybe you'll just break a little bone, or maybe you'll get killed. But there is always that, and that cost is always there. So then it becomes a kind of process of deal making, and then that gets into other areas like rituals and, dare I say, sacrifices. Something must be given for something to be received. So what would you give to know the future or to be able to change it? What is the price of doing that? And that brings in another aspect. And in some ways, the occult can be fairly transactional. Not where you're dealing with God, who has your interest at heart, but where you're dealing with lesser entities that, well, they don't do things for free. So if you want their assistance, you will have to give something. And the only question is, what is that?
Can we outline what those entities, I guess, would look like in the occult? Because that's something I think a lot of people don't necessarily correlate with. When they think the occult, it's a little bit spooky, obviously, and everything with that, but it also is, in a sense, its own religion or its own kind of way, as you're highlighting with a lot of details.
Well, religion is occultism. Okay, if you want to look for the simplest form of organ, so it's a larger world. So without defining any particular religion, if you're religious, do you believe that there is a larger reality than this one? Yeah. Okay. So you believe in the occult realm. Do you believe that there are intelligent entities who exist there outside of our kind of earthly framework? Well, yes. Okay. If you believe in God or gods, then you believe in the hidden world. And then there's always the opposite of that. We're getting close to that term demons. All right. Mm-hmm. There's a very popular term that comes up, which seems to cover a wide variety of self-conscious, disembodied things that allegedly exist, have no physical form, often seem to be extremely interested in having a physical form. Now, here's an interesting way. Now, keep in mind, I'm not preaching, okay? This is, I'm just interested in this in the same way that if you're listening and you're interested in what I'm saying. So I don't know. Maybe this is real. Maybe it isn't real. But it's a way of looking at it. We live in a seemingly very fixed physical reality. The world seems solid to us. It has seasons. We live on a planet. There are lots of other planets. All of this is, it seems very real. Yet, it's not everything. So the whole idea is that there is a greater or a different reality of which our reality is only a part is easily demonstrable if you have a pet, especially a dog or a cat. Because they live right beside you. They might sleep on your bed at night. but they don't live in exactly the same world that we do.
Mm-hmm.
So, an example, your dog can hear and smell things that you can't. You can see things that they can't. You know, our vision has all kinds of colors. To them, everything, the whole world is kind of, yellow and blue. There's no red, apparently. Now, that doesn't mean that their vision is inferior to ours. It means it's different. Mm-hmm. It's perfectly suited for what they need. That's real. That's their reality. That's what their world looks like. Their world looks different than ours does. It smells different. The sounds are different. They don't live in the same reality that we live in. We're sitting in the same room. It's an interesting idea. Your dog is sitting right beside you. They are experiencing a different reality than you are. You can get various sensory inputs they don't get, and they're getting ones that you don't have. They can sense all kinds of things that we can't. Also, apparently, it was explained to me, time moves differently for them. So supposedly for a dog or a cat, time, relatively speaking, moves about a third slower than it does for us, which means that to your dog, your voice is much deeper than it is to other humans. Think about that. So different realities exist side by side. The one that we experience is not the only one. It's the real one, but it's only part of the real one. Which then brings up the interesting idea of how much of that other one that you can bring into it. But it is solid. It is real. Things happen here. So for those people who actually purport to deal with spirits, one of the things that spirits, which means disembodied intelligences of one kind or another, always seem to be very keen about doing is coming into our reality. They really like that idea. Why? The argument is because here's where things happen. Where they are, nothing happens. Why does nothing happen? Because there's no time there. Time is the mechanism that makes everything happen. It moves. It moves everything along. So if there's no time, nothing moves. Now, imagine being conscious, having no physical form, and being in a place where nothing happens because there's no time. I would think it would be like, I think of it as a giant bus station somewhere in the back rooms that you could never escape from. So yes, be quite, to get into the place where things would happen. Sometimes I've seen people connected to the idea of reincarnation as to why supposedly our spirits always keep coming back. Why you keep coming back for more? And what are you coming back for? Okay. Well, you're coming back for all the pleasant things that exist in this realm, but you're also coming back for the disappointment, the misery, the pain, and ultimately death. Because that's the one thing that you are absolutely guaranteed of if you come back here. You will die, and it will almost never be pleasant. Mm-hmm. Okay? It can be less onerous than the other one, but there's no real easy way of getting out of it. So why would you keep doing that? Why wouldn't you escape if you were a free spirit and you could move on to nirvana or, I don't know, Poughkeepsie or wherever it is you're going to go? Why wouldn't you? Because this is where things happen. This is where you feel things. This is where you experience things. This is where you can experience both the glory of a drink of cold water when you're thirsty, which of course is connected to the misery of being thirsty. But it's the only place that you can experience any things. And this, the Gnostics, okay, people like the Cathars would tell you, see, that's it. That's the trap of the physical world. That's why you keep coming. It is a constant trap which brings you back, which the ultimate goal is to escape from. My question is, escape to what? Boredom? Who knows? Keep coming back and suffering, because suffering is at least being.
Why do you think agencies like the CIA, I'm using this as a broad example, it's not specific, but just there's plenty of, and I'm sure we'll get to this with Epstein later, but why do you think that there is such a keen interest in the occult? Do you think it's for power that you can use over an individual, whether that's being able to control an asset, being able to control a populace, or do you think there is some level of genuine belief that some of the more mystical elements can be utilized?
I think it's all of those things. How's that? Well, again, it comes back, could this work? So, give an example. I'm sure this isn't anything particularly unique. But in the 1920s, in Soviet Russia, there was an avowed occultist, a mystic by the name of Alexander Barchenko. And he wasn't a Bolshevik, but, the Bolsheviks were in power. So if you were going to, get a job, you had to deal with them. So one of the things that he was trying to sell to what was then the Cheka, or the GPU, the precursor to the it keeps changing its name, all right? Precursor to the KGB. He was trying to sell them the idea that his mystical researches, his occult pursuits could be very useful to them, because he had a wide array of interests. He was interested in everything from UFOs to lost civilization. He was like a one-stop shop for weirdness. But he was very interested. He at one point came up with a kind of his early version of the God helmet, this kind of helmet he thought that would amplify psychic powers. Very interested in telepathy, the idea of sharing thoughts or even putting thoughts. Now there's the idea. Can you extract ideas from people's minds without them knowing it? Can you put ideas into people's minds without their knowing it? Now imagine what an intelligence agency could do with that. Just imagine how that would work. Would that be worth a few $1 million maybe, or a few billion, to investigate just the possibility of the tremendous advantages that would give? So Barchenko in the 20s was trying to sell Soviet intelligence on the idea that he could do that. And his idea was that and they listened. They did put some money. No, not a lot. And it wasn't as if everybody was convinced of it, but he got a couple of guys in a high position to think that, well, maybe there's something to this, and we should look into it. So they kind of funded his researches. Because if this guy's onto something, we could now find a foolproof means of operating a spy system. If our people could communicate with each other telepathically, there would no longer be the need for any of those, pesky invisible ink messages or radios. You wouldn't need any of that. Our spies would just have a vast telepathic communication of espionage. How much would you be willing to spend to figure out whether or not that's real and could be utilized? Same way, is it possible through some sort of individual or mass concentration to cause change in conformity with will? What will we change? I don't know. Let's find out if we can do it. So there are those kinds of potentially very practical, real world, our solid, limited world advantage to having those things if they work. Now, what if you look into them and you find out they do work? You're going to tell everybody? You're going to go on Oprah? You're going to come on this show and tell, oh yeah, all this stuff works. Magic is real. It all works. We can manipulate real. No. The minute you found out that works, that would become the biggest secret you would have to contain. I mean, you don't want your opponent to find out that your spies can communicate telepathically, because they're going to start looking into it, and then that would destroy your advantage. No, see, this is maybe this is the secret in history that it was always disguised. If you find something really cool and really powerful, the thing you do is you shut up about it. You never tell anyone except those who absolutely need to know. And almost nobody needs to know, because that would destroy. See, you can't manipulate people if they know they're being manipulated, which is what much of this is really about. I mean, one way to control reality, even without tables and marbles, is just to control information and control people's perception of reality. What's possible and what's impossible. So it might be very useful to convince the mass of people that something is impossible, that something does not exist and can never exist, which does exist, but its advantage in the fact that only you know it exists, so that only you get to play with it.
See, that's where something like MK Ultra comes up as well, because when you look at it, it's obviously using substance to try to get a bit of an advantage, but I know they did different tests as well with people with quote unquote psychopathic powers, or not psychopathic. I'm blanking on the word right now. Foresight.
Well, psychic powers.
Psychic powers, rather. And then the one where they're able to visualize certain areas. Like, there was a lot of really unique testing. Remote viewing. I mean, that's one it seems like that's where it gets a unique blend, where it starts, we're adding science as we know it, to the occult and doing tests there to see how can we bend reality or work reality in our favor.
Well, there was a document that someone sent me. I don't remember who, and it's an FBI report from 1949. So remember, MK Ultra doesn't come along until 53. There were precursors to it. But this is from 1949. This is early. And the FBI is making a report on a meeting that took place in New York City in a private home. But it was the meeting of a secret government committee, one that had been put together by, I think, Secretary of Defense Forrestal, I think, the guy that later jumped or got pushed out of a building.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a committee, a secret committee on biological warfare. Now, usually today when we think of biological warfare, we think of germs, but that wasn't the way that they were using the term. This was things that would be applicable in warfare or irregular warfare involving any kind of biological entity. Humans, animals, bacteria, whatever it might be. And there were, the participants in the meeting were given a talk. It was a presentation by two people from the CIA, which had just been created a couple of years before. One of those people was a guy by the name of Cleve Baxter. And Cleve Baxter, some people might recognize as the guy who's basically the father of the modern lie detector. Okay, pretty much came up with the device and how the device is used and its results are interpreted. So Baxter was the lie detector guru for the CIA. But in this period, he and another fellow were giving a presentation on hypnotic suggestion and its applications. Now, see, that's biological because it's one person doing this to another. Now, there are interesting parts of the report that, as always, are redacted, but the key conclusions at the end are still there. And the most interesting thing to me, now remember, this is 1949. You got two guys from the CIA who are giving a presentation to a secret committee, and they think that the great potential in hypnotic suggestion would be the ability to remove memories from subjects' minds and to implant memories. Erase memories and implant memories.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, sounds familiar. And this is in 49. So it wasn't in 53 that they came up with this idea. And they thought that this had great potential. Mm-hmm. And this is what they were going to working for. And so But that, you know, whatever results they actually achieved, the thing to note here is that these are two, basically, technical people from an intelligence agency talking to other people about their desire to basically perfect the ability to erase memories and implant false memories. That is their goal. Did they achieve that end? Well, that's one of those things you would never come out and admit. Yeah, we can erase your memory. Okay. No, the minute you found out you could do that, you would completely shut up about it. But that's essentially what MK Ultra, in my opinion, for what it's worth, is simply an elaboration of those processes. So one could argue that, yes, those early experiments apparently yielded some promising results because they then decided a few years later to invest a lot more time and money into it and to vastly expand the program. How much of that program worked? Now, the general description you get today is that it was all a waste of money. Nothing ever came of it. We never found anything that was suitable. Yeah, we did it for years and years and years and years until we got caught, and then we stopped, and then we stopped doing it. We've never done anything like that again. Those are almost certainly, almost totally lies from beginning to end, but they're necessary lies in this case, because if any of this worked, that's the first thing that you would have to deny, is that any of it works.
In your mind, do you think that the project was a success? Or have you seen any indicators that points in that direction?
I find it hard to believe that one would have persisted at something that long unless you were getting some encouragement to continue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if there was no application to it, if nothing was coming out, it would have been dropped fairly early. So yes, in my opinion, something sufficiently encouraging to impel further research and further money and further test subjects was there. Now, in the end, did you come up with something that you could really weaponize? I mean, that's, maybe you find something, but you can't really weaponize it because you can't get dependable results. Sometimes it works sometimes. Yeah, it's another of those cases where I say, yeah, there's something going on here, and there were some kind of results obtained, or the project wouldn't have continued as long as it did. But the fruits of that project are not for public dissemination.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it would defeat the whole purpose if you ever let on. You certainly would want your opposition to think that, no, none of this worked. You don't want to encourage them to look into this, even though they probably are. They might well have thought of that on your own, but no, and you certainly wouldn't want to tip them off that, yeah, we've got the secret to bend reality. Okay, yeah, that's it. Let's come up with a really secret weapon and let's go blab about it. No, that's just not the way that would work.
So that kind of brings my follow-up with this. I know you're working around this topic at breakfast, but when you look at the MK Ultra files, it's like the beginning is when they were really doing the good work, and then it seems like the stuff they released, they tried to make it look as crazy as possible. It's like, oh, we started going this direction and adding this on top. And again, like if I was in the shoes of leadership, as we discussed, like you want to make it look as crazy as possible, because if you did find something, you don't want people looking at it too deeply. You want it to look as crazy as possible. So there seems like there's a bit of a blend there as well, where it's the stuff that we got exposed to, it tried to make it look like it was a flat earth project versus something that could actually be weaponized. Do you think that's could possibly be in the cards as well in terms of how they were approaching different experiments and what actually got released to the public?
Well, one of the problems you've got with MK Ultra is you only have a smattering of surviving documents. So you don't know how all of these pieces fit together, if they do fit together. I mean, maybe it was one of these things. I mean, they're eventually what? I've seen 50 or 150 different sub-projects. The fact that you can't give me an exact number suggests that maybe you lost count. But one thing would apparently lead to another. It seems to have been kind of a shotgun effect. But why would that be the case? I mean, again, if you're dealing with one project and it's not producing any results, you're not then going to spin that off into a half dozen projects. Mm-hmm. That would suggest to me that you were getting some kind of results, and then you wanted to refine that by breaking it down into sub-projects to look at different parts of it. I don't know, maybe it was just government bureaucrats spending money because, okay, we have to say we're doing something because otherwise we won't get money anymore. There's that aspect of it as well. But I don't think it was just years and years of wasting money willy-nilly on things that you were getting no results from. You were getting enough results to encourage you to carry on the research. What it amounts to in the end, I mean, there are all kinds of things that might appear to be very intriguing. So, well, let's suppose that in the process of these MK Ultra projects that we don't know about and can only suspect and can then wildly speculate on, there's always the stories that MK Ultra began to veer off or to veer into the area of the occult. I don't know. Let's put it this way. Could we summon demons to help us? Okay. Maybe they're not all bad. I don't know. Are they these disembodied intelligence out there that are willing to do things? And we've got money. We've got other things we could provide. I mean, child sacrifice would be a tough part to get past Congress. But nevertheless, if we didn't tell them, could that work?
Had someone outside doing that.
Could we get demons to help the cause of the free world against the Soviets and their demons? Well, again, that would be a tough sell, so you'd probably want to keep that pretty much internalized. Well, one of the problems, and this is a problem within occult practice, is that, demons, spirits are often kind of ornery. This is why you have to summon them and then bind them in all sorts of ways, because they aren't giving this help willingly. They're sort of being trapped and lassoed and forced to do these types of things. They can be uncooperative, and they can be deceitful, and they can be dangerous, okay? Everything in terms of rituals warns you about that. So that's apparently why they draw all these things on the floor, and you have to take all these banishing spells and everything else, because this is hazardous to your health to get into. They're kind of radioactive. You can't control them that well. That arguably is why there are stage magicians. That's where there are magic tricks. Magic tricks. So the thing with a trick is that you just have to practice and practice and practice and practice. But once you've mastered the trick, well, it works every time. Pretty much. Almost all the time. And that's controllable. Now, if you had to go out on stage every night and summon a demon to make you do these things, it might not be feeling cooperative that evening, and then everything would fall apart. That requires a lot of work and time and trouble and danger. A trick just takes time and practice. So, if you were an intelligence agency that was trying to exploit the occult and to try to, just imagine, enlist demons on the side of your cause, spirits, whatever term you want to get, demons sound so.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one thing to remember is from the Greek original, demons simply meant a spirit. Good or bad. Cacodemons were the evil spirits in this case. Demons were just kind of a generic term. So see, it can shift around in its meanings. That would have been a particular hazardous work in its own way, and you wouldn't necessarily have gotten predictable, usable results. I mean, a weapon system isn't any good if it only works part of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It could backfire.
You pull a trigger in a rifle, it doesn't always work, but it should work most of the time. It's supposed to work. If it was always the possibility, I don't know, it's 50-50, Bullet might go off, bullet might not go off.
Or a bullet might shoot back at you.
Well, this is like when they were dealing with the atom bomb. They didn't know exactly, nobody had ever blown one of these things up before. So it was the whole question, is it going to set the atmosphere on fire and destroy the world? Maybe. We don't think there's much of a chance of that. There is a chance, we think, but not much of a chance. So let's try it and see what happens. So they did. Even calculating there was a slight chance that it might destroy the whole world, it's still worth it for science and national security to do these things. So the thing with MK Ultra to me is that we just get we got a name. And then, of course, even that changes. You've got MK Naomi, and then in 63 it changes to what? MK Search. And they're always playing around with these terms. It's the same thing. They just attached a different name to it. Or think of it this way. It's the same demon. It just has a different name.
The main way, have you heard of like DMT, like some of the research that's going behind that right now with ayahuasca and like treatment for troops with PTSD?
Drugs? Another important part of MK Ultra research.
So like that's kind of, I guess the secondary direction I would go with that is even if they didn't necessarily believe that we can bring these entities into the world, if you can use drugs to convince a given individual that this entity is speaking to them and telling them to do such and such action, it would be a very powerful tool as well, because you get somebody, I mean, again, pointing towards Epstein, because especially with the emails, there has been some weird, tie-ins, but someone like Charles Manson or any of these people that you may point to, is that if you get them believing that there's a commandment from a higher power, it's quite simply easy to get them to act in a way that you may want. So it seems like that's also another opportunity there where you can use drugs to convince people and put on the persona of a given demon or anything like that to try to influence.
Well, there are people, I have never taken DMT or ayahuasca, an interesting admission. But just to clear that, so I'm not speaking from experience on that, but I have spoken to people who have, who I think are reasonably honest in their appraisals, and they all pretty much say the same thing. Yeah, you take this, and there are these entities, and they all sort of describe them in the same way, and they talk to you, and they're always trying to explain things to you, and they're always saying things like, pay attention, listen to what we're doing. We're trying to show you something, stupid. So the same, it could be the same chemicals that are creating the same sort of inner experience, or is opening up a vista to again, this larger world. The one that occultists has always been saying is out there and it's inhabited and it's full of all kinds of things. Well, what's going on is that people take these drugs, they encounter entities, they have the same experience. And I mean, the only thing I can connect that to is that there are certainly people who, under the influence of LSD, would have simultaneous identical hallucinations. How does that work? Mm-hmm. Okay. How does the drug produce an identical hallucination in different people at the same time? Have they all been transported to some different reality, or is there just, what's going on? Okay, that's the question. We should always be asking, from the moment we were born, should be trying to figure what is going on. There's all this stuff here. And then we get all these explanations about what's going on. Your parents gave you explanations about what was going on. Church gave you explanations of what was going on. School teachers gave you explanations about what's going on. Scientists give you explanations about what's going on. None of them, I'm convinced, have a clear picture of what's going on. And some of those explanations can be quite honest, and some of them can just be outright lies meant to hide from you what's going on. Mm-hmm. And that's just the kind of conundrum of existence, isn't it? This is, I think, an unpleasant reality, but one which must be considered by all thinking people, is that basically from the moment we are born, we're lied to. We've been told all kinds of lies because your parents have lied to you. Priests probably lied to you. The government definitely lies to you. And so do school teachers, often with the best intentions.
Mm-hmm.
Because, lots of times that's necessary. You have to deceive people. In some cases, the truth is just too unpleasant, or it simply doesn't suit your agenda or theirs. But yes, constantly bombarded by lies from day one. In fact, probably most of the things that we've been told by anyone have been lies, intentionally or otherwise. Makes it extremely difficult to figure out what the truth, whatever that exactly would be defined, is. That's always what we're trying to do. I think, as I might have said earlier, in terms of my researchers, it's not trying to prove any particular thing one way or the other. It's just to figure out what's going on. Most of the time, I come to the conclusion that something's going on, but I'm not sure what it is. So you keep looking. It sounds better in Latin, and I can't remember that, but there's an old phrase which goes, an old meaning no one is quite sure where it comes from, although it probably has an origin. The world wishes to be deceived, and so it is deceived. Right? You really don't want the truth. You want a palatable, convenient story. So I'll give you a palatable, convenient story. And if we're in any kind of matrix, I think that's the one that we're caught up in. Mm-hmm. We're caught up in a matrix of lies, being told from all directions about all kinds of things with both beneficial and malicious intent. And therefore, again, if you're a thinking person, whatever that might be, that's what you have to navigate through.
So that brings up the question, and I feel like this is a common area where people get caught in terms of like they want to think that some all-knowing, all-powerful society is actually in control. They're at the steering wheel of the ship. But then there's a reverse of that in that there's tons of different intelligence agencies. There's tons of different agencies all kind of playing their own Game of Thrones type chess match, and that no one's really in control. I guess this is a two-part question, but one, in your mind, which is scarier? And two, which direction do you think is more likely?
Which is scarier? The possibility that nobody is really in control,
Mm-hmm.
that it's a ship without a captain. Off course, possibly headed for an iceberg, but nobody's really sure because nobody's paying any attention. Now, the opposite of that is the idea is that, there's somebody in control. If it's not the government that's in control, it's the Illuminati, okay? Mm-hmm. I mean, there has to be somebody running things. It can't just be, a ship without a captain, because we can't really imagine that, and there's also nothing you can really do about it. Well, I don't know. I mean, here's an idea, this is the closest I'll get to being political, but let's look at one of the highest sources of authority in our society, Congress. Are they in control? Okay. Are the people that ostensibly we elected, I mean, probably not you or I, because I probably didn't vote for any of them, but that they're in charge, okay? Everything's in charge. I would argue, no, I don't see anybody in charge there. I barely see anybody doing anything.
Yeah.
So they're not in charge. Who is running things? Are the people who are running things competent to be running them? The guy says he's a captain, but is he actually a captain? Has he ever operated a ship before? We don't know. We're just kind of told that they have it. I think, this is just, what do I think is going on? I think there are lots of people who believe they're in charge. There may even be an Illuminati who think they're in charge, But in charge of what? What are they actually controlling? Have they discovered the occult mechanisms to control reality? This is the result that we get? Is this what they would want to have? Are they living in some completely different reality? I think there are a lot of people who want to be in control, who in some cases think they're in control, but they're really not in control.
I guess a follow-up question on that then. God, you mentioned this on some other podcasts, and the idea of like you spoke to somebody high up in various agencies, and they say they've been through tons of different presidencies, and the presidents always come and go, the politicians always come and go, but people that are working in these areas are they're lifelongers. It's their career. When you look at somebody like the president of the United States, there's always this discussion of like when you first get elected, they bring you into a room and they're like, so aliens are real, the Illuminati's real. Like obviously, not this extreme, but this is the first time they're hearing about a lot of these topics, most likely. Can one really look at the president of the United States and say that they're the most powerful person in the world?
No. Because they're temporary. They'll only be there for, well, technically 4 to 8 years so far. Except for FDR, he managed, but, they're temporary. They're also generally by nature politicians, which means that their primary concern is, what everybody seems to be concerned about is their legacy. How am I going to be interpreted in history? Which I think on occasion might distract you from the here and now, as opposed to what needs to be done now without necessarily making it about you. Which again verges on being perhaps more political. I'm talking about all presidents in this case, but there's a certain amount of egotism that comes with the job. And well, here's an interesting idea, which I'll just throw out there. It's not original with me. Is that all politicians, or almost all of them, we always have to make an exception, are basically psychopaths. Okay, and that's humanity's great curse, is that throughout history we've always been governed by psychos, because psychos are the ones who want to seek power over everyone else, and they're narcissists and manipulative and ruthless. And those are the people who end up in power. Most people are pretty easygoing and will generally honest and helpful and will go along with things and are continually run roughshod over by the psychos who assume positions of leadership and then convince us to make them gods, okay, or to believe that they are, and pretty much engage in giant vanity projects and endless wars in order to assuage that, in which we all get to slave away and die. That's an unpleasant way of thinking about it. But I think there's something to the political leadership are psychos. I think that might have something to it.
So let's jump into one of your works, which Agent 666, which focuses on Aleister Crowley. I kind of want to really hammer home a lot of the occult and the tie-ins there, but he's just such a unique individual, and also one of the first times that we've maybe started to see some cross-pollination with intelligence. So can you maybe just detail who he was and why he's a critical player in occultism?
Well, Aleister Crowley is probably hands down the most famous and influential occultist of the 20th century. All roads sort of lead back to him. That's why he always comes up when you open the door to that. He wasn't particularly successful or well known in his lifetime. So he died in 47. Gee, same year the CIA was born and UFOs appeared. What does that mean? The coincidence. Is that significant or not? I don't know. Or I'm not sure. Crowley was a product of late Victorian, Edwardian British society, came from a fairly well-to-do family, could have done lots of other things in his life. had a variety of talents. For one thing, he was like a world-class mountaineer, okay? Could have become Sir Edmund Hillary, but no, he decided he wanted to become an occultist. Why? Because he had personal mystical experiences that seemed to him to open a door to this greater world and the powers within it, and which basically told him he believed that he was going to become a kind of new Christ, that he was going to come up with a new religion, Thelema, which would replace Christianity, become a new paradigm for humanity. And that was he was going to be, he was going to be a Jesus, a Muhammad, a Joseph Smith. He was going to come along and create this whole new system. That did not happen in his lifetime, which to him proved to be an increasingly bitter disappointment. So I think it's fair to say that Crowley died in 47, feeling that he had failed and that the powers of the unseen world had in some way abandoned. And he actually sort of laments this at one point, that I had these experiences that opened this awareness to me. This other world sort of reached out and touched me and spoke to me and told me I was going to do these things, and then just kind of left me hanging. Never really fulfilled those promises. And I spent my whole life pursuing this. Crowley was a difficult character in a lot of ways, terrible with money, okay? Probably not a particularly good friend in some ways. He has been accused of driving every woman that he was connected with insane. I think that's unfair. They were probably partly there to begin with, and he just finished the job off, but he did finish it off. Problematic guy. Was he the prince of evil? Was he a Satanist? In my estimation, no. Never claimed to be. Maybe he was without knowing it. He saw himself as a kind of Gandalf, as a kind of, gray magician way. It's sort of battling the forces of evil. Or maybe that was just all BS from his standpoint. Maybe he wasn't entirely sure. But he left behind him a number of works, again, for what it's worth, my estimation, Magic in Theory and Practice, a kind of manual, maybe the most significant of those. But the other thing, besides being I would say, an unsuccessful in his lifetime occultist and would-be religious leader, he also, at some point early on, found himself recruited into the murky world of British intelligence. That almost certainly happened when he was a student at Cambridge, from which he never graduated. I mean, his initial idea was he wanted to go into Her Majesty's diplomatic service, got detoured from that, partly by his mystical experiences, which sent him off in another direction. So being an occultist was his vocation. That's what he would devote his life to. But there's another side to him, and I think one of the ways to understand that is to understand that there are always sort of two Crowleys that exist side by side. So his real name is not Aleister Crowley. That is a version of his middle name, Alexander, that he sort of invented and adopted early on to differentiate himself partly from his father, who was Edward Alexander Crowley, and that's Aleister Crowley's real name, Edward Alexander Crowley. So on passports, with one exception that I know of, in other documents, in census records, in official records, he went by his legal name. The name he always was his legal name, Edward Alexander Crowley. So those are just names, but names also carry with them a kind of persona in a way. So I want to note that he's always both these people. Aleister Crowley that is the character name. That's the kind of stage name he invented for his occultist persona. So as a student and practitioner of the occult, he becomes Aleister. But he's still, as some of his early friends called him, Eddie. Imagine that. Okay. Eddie Crowley. And that was a slightly different version of this person. So, Crowley at one point, in some moment of introspection, sort of lamented the fact that he hadn't become just kind of an English squire. Now, what was his kind of alternative persona, his alter ego? His alter ego was Sir Edward Crowley, who lived in a modest manor house somewhere in rural England and was surrounded by hounds and dogs and servants and lived a kind of genteel life there as a proper English gentleman. Part of him always wanted to be that, which he could have been if he'd simply been able to manage his money better and do other things. Mm-hmm. It was a life that he didn't choose, but which I think he still sort of lived vicariously. The Aleister Crowley, the stage persona, in a way, if you want to think of it, begins to take over the person. It's the idea that if you play a role long enough, the role begins to play you. And which is not to say, as some people have accused me of saying, that Aleister Crowley was an act, that he was never sincere about his occult beliefs, that he was always just pretending to be something, that this was a kind of performance. Not insisting it couldn't have been that to a degree, but I think he was sincere about his occult interests. But one of the questions that would come up is that why would a man who seemed to reject existing British society, who seemed to hold nothing in contempt, a fellow who was, believing in recreational drugs, unlimited ritual and non-ritual sex, sex, a fellow, a libertine, an occultist, possibly a Satanist, who knows, why would that person ever serve his country, even in the sense of in an intelligence capacity? Well, one reason might be is that it suited his ego to do so. It pleased him to do so. But why might it please him to do so? Well, he was once challenged on that. That why would a man like you, what kind of patriotism could you possibly have? And he gave what I think was a sincere and very interesting answer to that. And this was, it would apply to either world war, but he goes, I don't think that for a moment that the English pot is any less black than the German kettle. So I don't think that England is morally superior to Germany. I don't think that's what it's about. We're not, it's not as if we're fighting for some sort of grander cause. God isn't necessarily on our side. After all, they're the ones who have the belt buckles that say Gott mit uns, and where did that get them? So he goes, no, that's not what it's about. To me, patriotism isn't a moral choice. He goes, mine is the loyalty of Bill Sykes' dog. I think that's an Oliver Twist reference. You got Bill Sykes, who's a crook. He's got this dog that follows him around. And he goes, my master starves me and he beats me, but still he is my master and I love him. So that was his kind of explanation as to why he loved England. He didn't love England as a kind of moral cause. He loved England as a dog loves its master, just because you do. A way of elaborating that, he goes, the difference is that I'm an Englishman, I'm not a German. And if England and Germany are at war, then I side with England, because what else can I do? It's just in my nature to do it that way. So he goes, that's my patriotism. I just do it because it's in my nature to do so. And I was born English, so I'm on England's side. And I think that seems to be a fairly straightforward answer to that type of thing. Now, there are the thing that got me interested, and the reason the book Secret Agent 666 is an extension of an article which has the same name because I just decided to reuse it. It's a good name.
It's a good title.
I liked it. And the article that the book came out of was all based on the idea that Crowley at various times after the First World War, whose activities were judged to be traitorous, which outwardly they were, no doubt about that, would protest that no, actually he had served His Majesty, he had been loyal, that he had apparently been doing traitorous things, but he was doing it for a patriotic reason. Nobody believed it. Sounded improbable. I mean, even people who otherwise tended to believe anything Aleister Crowley said doubted that. And you can't just believe it because he says so. So I was kind of interested about that, what was going on. Mm-hmm. So I decided I would look into it. So one of the things I got a hold of was an American intelligence report for what was then called the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Division from 1918. Now, so to set the stage for this, Crowley, during the First World War, is in the United States for virtually the entire war. Comes to the country on Halloween 1914, and he's here actually until the end of 1919. So what's he doing here? Dodging the war? Well, some would later accuse him of doing that. Was he writing pro-German propaganda? Yeah, he was doing that. He was also a lot of sex and drugs, and magical workings, which were included in it. So Crowley was on a kind of mission. The question is how do I know he was on a mission? Well, when you get these U.S. intelligence reports, there's a report from the MID officer in upstate New York, around West Point. I don't know if Crowley had been active. He was camping out on an island. And the Americans were very suspicious of him. They had entered the war. They knew about his previous pro-German activities in the United States. And they were thinking about arresting him. So they acquired, or at least, bringing him in for questioning. So they inquired to the British consulate in New York. And here was the thing that sort of, often, one of the things you do as an historian is you can just go through hundreds of pages of stuff and there's nothing there and there's nothing there. What you're looking for, it's like panning for gold. Mm-hmm. Okay, you're looking for these little pieces of pay dirt that are going to show up. And there was the reply from the British consulate in New York that said Crowley is in this country on the official business of the British government, of which we are fully aware, along with his previous activities. So, in that case, Aleister Crowley was telling the truth. The British consulate just said so. He was in the country on some sort of official mission. Doesn't tell you what that mission is. Mm-hmm. That still leaves that bit. That doesn't answer the whole question. That's often the case. You get an answer to the question, and you find out that just brings up another question. Well, the interesting thing here is that they don't tell you what that is, and that's not an accidental omission. So he's there on some sort of official business that we're not going to detail. Okay, so cut to the chase here. What was Crowley actually doing? He was infiltrating the German propaganda and sabotage organization. So the Germans don't have, because of the British blockade, the Germans don't have access to the U.S. Unlike the British and the French, they can't come in and get American companies to build weapons for them, munitions. They don't have J.P. Morgan on their side financing the war, which is the British did. And so their idea was that they had to rely upon trying to blow up stuff before it got on ships and went across the Atlantic. So they did have a whole sabotage operation. And they also pretty amateurishly tried to influence American public opinion, to keep the Americans out of the war because war's scary. Mm-hmm. So Crowley, through a German-American publisher by the name of George Sylvester Viereck. Now, Viereck published a pro-German magazine in New York called The Fatherland. Because if I was going to publish a pro-German magazine, that's what I would call it. So, Der Vaterland, or The Fatherland for the English edition. Crowley goes in and right away starts writing anti-British articles for The Fatherland. I mean, stuff about, how cool Zeppelins were bombing London and what a grotesque little ogre the king was. So those were things that, might well have been judged treasonous once the war was over. But that was only the sort of entree, because Crowley through that then became, through Viereck, admitted to a thing called the Propaganda Cabinet in New York. And this is where German diplomatic officials, German-American intellectuals, publishers would get together and they would try to plot out what they thought the German PR program should be. And Crowley prided himself, for instance, on trying to convince them that the way to deal with Americans was to scare them. As he said, that Americans were immature people, that they were like children, and therefore the Germans needed to always appear to be forceful and that if you got into a war with us, it would be bad, okay, we'd eat you alive. And so the idea was to kind of scare them and intimidate them, which he also said he knew was exactly the opposite tactic. Okay, but his idea was that the Germans were imbeciles, his term, and that they would fall for this because it flattered their egos to think of themselves that way. And he didn't take credit for the sinking of the Lusitania, but he did claim some credit for convincing the Germans that doing things like sinking an ocean liner would be a good idea because it made him look tough and fearful, and they fell for it. To a huge public relations disaster for them. But the other thing he did through this is that he apparently got the opportunity to get a telephone tap placed in the offices where these meetings took place, and then also got little tidbits about the sabotage, which he then passed on to. Now, Crowley's connected to British naval intelligence, not to what we think of as MI6. They had a separate operation. They seem to have been dimly aware of what he was doing. But this is one of the other things to understand about intelligence and agency. Rarely is a nation's intelligence one thing. It's usually a house of several rooms. So the Admiralty was who he was connected to. And he was passing information on. But the other question to me was that, well, why would the Germans have ever taken him seriously? I mean, why does this guy just kind of waltz in and now he's admitted to these meetings? There had to have been someone vouching for him. And that had to have been someone in Germany. And again, it wasn't too hard if you go back to figure out who that was. So back around 1910, 1911 in England, before the war, Crowley was initiated into a German secret society, an occult society called the Ordo Templi Orientis. It's still around, and the remnant of it today is still basically connected to Crowley. He'll end up sort of the head of this. But when he joined it, it's purely a German order, and the fellow who initiated him was a German by the name of Theodor Reuss. And Theodor Reuss was an occultist, a journalist, and a German intelligence officer, who in fact was going to what you're going to do is you're going to set up this esoteric order and it's going to have branches in different countries. Well, that's great for occult stuff. It's also great as a cover for spies.
Wow.
So one thing serving a double purpose. What Royce thought he was doing back in 1911 was that he was recruiting Crowley for German intelligence. So in 1914, when someone in New York checked back to Berlin, where guess what? Theodor Reuss is now a wartime, full-time intelligence officer for the Kaiser's Germany. Reuss said, yeah, he's okay. He's one of our sworn brothers. So it was Crowley's initiation into a nominally occult order that then gave him the credibility later to assume a position of confidence among the Germans of the United States, and as a British double agent, spy on them
That is
and give them bad advice. So the pieces begin to fall into place. Now, when the war was over and he came back to England in 1919, you might expect there would be some trouble.
Mm-hmm.
From the officialdom, there was no trouble. In fact, his passport was outdated. Oh, at one point, actually, during the war, he held this whole little stunt at the Statue of Liberty where he went out and declared the independence of Ireland and said a bunch of other gobbledygook and supposedly tore up his British passport. Well, his actual passport was back in the desk in his room, okay, because he still had it. It was just a bunch of papers he tore up. That was a stunt. And one of the ways you can tell that is before this stunt was performed, he actually made sure that a reporter from the New York Times was there to cover it. Okay. So you see something that looks spontaneous and someone has invited a reporter from a newspaper to be there. It's not spontaneous. It's a dog and pony show. So he goes back, and before he went back to New York, back to London, he went to the consulate, that same consulate in New York, and got a new passport issued. So if the British government had any problem with him, they could have just stranded him in Yankee Land and never let him back into the country. But no, here's your new passport, Eddie. Okay, you can go back, and he lands with no problem. But the British press, same then as now, caught on to this, and they knew what he had been doing in America, and they raised a whole hue and cry, and so he quickly leaves, goes to France, and basically doesn't come back to England for about 10 years. He's simply, anytime he would do that, the press would raise an issue. And the press would raise an issue and want to know, what's the government going to do about him? How can you let this traitor run around? Well, then somebody might have to go and explain things, and no one's going to do that. Mm-hmm. So here was the conundrum that Crowley found himself in. Aleister Crowley, the occultist, had earned a bad reputation. He was seen as a libertine, as a wicked man, possibly a devil worshiper, and now a traitor. Edward Alexander Crowley had secretly served his country, but the secret part was the most important element. That could never be publicly admitted. Why? Why couldn't Crowley simply come out and write a whole memoir about his spy exploits? Because that would unravel a whole series of things. So if it was made public knowledge that Aleister Crowley, the wickedest man in the world, was in the service of the British government, there might be questions about that, which no one wanted to answer. Furthermore, if you knew Crowley was a British operative, then you could begin again, as we just did, to kind of deconstruct the whole thing. And it would raise questions because he had dealings with other secret British operatives in America. Mm-hmm. That would reveal organization, and it would reveal tradecraft. In other words, the sneaky, spooky things we spooks do are not to be publicly known. And if one person is outed, that will undoubtedly lead to a cascading situation in which other things about our methods and the people that work for us will be exposed. So you, Aleister Crowley, you can never publicly say this. You will live the rest of your life publicly reviled as a traitor. We know what you did. You know what you did. But no one else is supposed to. And that was difficult for him because later on he tried, he kind of, I think for a while thought being the wickedest man in the world was kind of a cool thing. Okay, pissed a lot of people off. But then, it becomes that stink that just never goes away and it follows you around. And he made unsuccessful attempts to try to redeem his reputation. None of them really worked. And he would make these occasional statements about, I really worked for the British government. Nobody believed. And by the way, anytime he did that, he got into trouble. There would be some kind of little reminder, okay, that you're supposed to keep your mouth shut. But they kept, they sort of kept him on a string. Well, this is what they did, and this is generally what those agencies do. They don't become your friend. That's not what it's about. They don't love you. They use you. And you're useful to them so long as you are useful. And when you're not, you will be discarded. And you will do things that you can never talk about. And if you do talk about them, there will be terrible consequences. And you will simply have to live with everything that comes with that. So that made the latter years of Crowley's life difficult in a number of ways. But when World War II rolled along, he's called back and served, because he's useful. Now, this was the other thing that came up, another sort of a documentary evidence of his intelligence connections. So in 1939, just before World War II breaks out, the British government carries out a kind of census, a survey of the British public. And, it's got people's names and addresses and professions. And it also notes any kind of prior military experience or connections. That's usually noted in a blue pencil. And sure enough, Edward A. Crowley is in this. And it is noted over to the side, emergency list NID. What was that? Well, NID is the Naval Intelligence Division. The emergency list was a special list, usually of former officers, which I don't know that he was, that was there in case of an emergency, that they might be called back in for some prior service. So, eve of World War II, he's still connected to the Naval Intelligence Division, and they have him on the emergency list to be called up in the case of an emergency, a war being an emergency. And sure enough, they do. War breaks out, gets a note, the head of naval intelligence, basically given a phone number to call, talk to, I think, a Captain Lang. And what's the phone number? Knew a fellow whose hobby was collecting official phone numbers from the British around World War II, especially intelligence agency phone numbers, and then trying to figure out what those phone numbers were connected to. That's a weird hobby. But every weird hobby has its uses.
I was going to say.
And so when I gave him that phone number, he goes, oh, yeah, that's the section of NID, of Admiralty Intelligence, that deals with interrogation of prisoners of war. That's what they tap him for. Hence, you then get these later stories that Crowley was somehow involved in the interrogation of Rudolf Hess.
Really?
Yeah. Stories. But it kind of fits. Or that he was roaming around interrogating high-level Nazi prisoners at a place called Ham Common. British intelligence during World War II had a kind of black site just outside of London, which was Camp 020 or 020. I'm not sure how they did that. It's 020. Former, I think, boys' reformatory called Ham Common, or a school, and certain prisoners that were held, that were not held with other prisoners, were there and were subjected to various special interrogation techniques. And so there's one guy who later claims that, Crowley was walking around there all the time. Entirely possible. Probably there's something to that, considering it. Does he ever get any thanks for that? No, because, what thanks do you think you're going to get for interrogating prisoners that no one admits having at a camp that doesn't exist? But he goes on to, but he's, after the war is over, they keep him going. I mean, here's the thing. In 1934, Crowley tries to redeem his reputation by suing a woman who'd written fallacious things about him in a book. Stuff that really wasn't true. But what happens is that he doesn't win the case because he's being tried in court by his reputation. So all the defense has to do is that, look who's bringing charges against my client, the wickedest man in the world, okay, a traitor. So even though she lied, the stuff she's saying isn't true, And that uses up his money, and so he's from 1934 until his death in 1947. He is an undischarged bankrupt. He has no real income, but still he has a roof over his head and food. He's also by this time a hopeless heroin addict, and he gets a little packet of heroin, of smack, every week, okay, from a doctor. So who pays for all of this? Take some guesses as to who's sort of keeping him on the shelf for the day that a new war might come along and his unique set of skills might be useful. Now, I might wonder, what are those unique sorts of skills that he could possibly use as an interrogator of prisoners of war? Crowley was, through his magical workings, an avid user of drugs that was sort of used to enhance mental states that would be useful in magical workings. His favorite recreational drug, I mean, the stuff that he just liked to get high on, was ether, which is, for the uninitiated, just one tiny step above sniffing glue or huffing gas. Okay, you put ether on a rag and you sniff it and,
You're off to Looney Town.
Until you pass out, which you feel really good in between, apparently. Okay, it doesn't sound appealing to me. Even though gasoline kind of smells good, doesn't it?
It does.
It does. So, but the other thing that he experimented with, even in World War I, was mescaline peyote. Turns out that around 1915, the American Park Davis Pharmaceutical Company was the first company to synthesize the active ingredient in peyote, mescaline. And they produced it in their lab in Detroit. And Crowley, in period, actually went to Detroit and bought a whole paper sack pound of mescaline in a paper bag. Perfectly legal. And for the rest of the stay in the U.S., he used up the whole pound. Usually in magical workings, but one of the things that he would do was he would invite people for dinner, different people. Different sexes, different ages, different sizes, and he would serve them some kind of exotic meal, often a curry, in which he would put a certain amount of mescaline. And he would then observe what happened, and he would take notes on how the drug seemed to affect at different dosages different people. That has nothing to do with magic, so far as I can tell, but it does have something to the idea as to what the effect of this drug would be. And he had a whole compendium of this stuff. And it was all put together in one of his books, which was called The Cactus, which sounds about right. And that existed in 1919 when he went back to England. It has never been seen since. It is one of his missing works, so far as I know. So it may be in somebody's collection somewhere. So he had expertise in the use of drugs on people and their effects, both by experimenting on himself and others, and in particular with mescaline. So what was one of the things that Rudolf Hess, in his captivity, being, of course, crazy, as we were told, what did Rudolf Hess claim that the British were doing to him? He said, they're dosing me, they're putting Mexican brain poison in my food. What was Mexican brain poison? Turns out it was his term for mescaline. So Crowley is something of an expert in the use of mescaline. He's been approached by the branch of naval intelligence that deals with the interrogation of POWs. Hess becomes a high-profile POW, and then later claims that he's being given mescaline in his food.
Sounds familiar.
Kind of fits. So that's I think that's why Crowley shows this kind of interplay between, his initiation into an occult society is also his initiation ultimately into a long-term intelligence operation in which the Germans think he's working for them, but still working for the Brits, and his, recreation or otherwise dabbling with early psychedelics later may have something to do with completely discombobulating the brain of Rudolf Hess.
Well, this It's crazy when, I mean, it is in its own way like a lot of history, where history might not be the same, but it rhymes. It's interesting how kind of all these compound. This sounds very similar to use cases in MK Ultra, and then even recently, like with the Epstein documentation, there was discussions around them using drugs on those that were, high-powered individuals for wiping memories, or not wiping memories, but having them forget a certain period of time that they were able to take advantage of. And it's amazing that you could see it this early on, that tools are being leveraged, that kind of the mental realm was really being explored.
Well, that's one of the things about, in terms of, what historians do, or at least what I do, is that you begin to assemble bits and pieces of information. And one of the things I would generally caution researchers on is that try not to go into this with a preconceived agenda of what you want to have. If you approach it ideologically or something else, then you're going to skew the results, because inevitably you will simply end up proving what it is that you want to prove. Mm. So when I went looking as to whether or not Crowley was lying about having said to work for British intelligence, I didn't care if it came out one way or the other. I actually expected I would find evidence that, it was all BS. So I was kind of surprised when I didn't, which then made me look for other things. And I think, without anything in particular to prove, I didn't see it as my mission to redeem or to destroy his reputation, but just try to figure out what was going on. And as you begin to get the pieces together, the story will tell itself. The pieces will begin to fall. Okay, this, you'll go back. That's how these things fit together. That's the relationship you didn't understand between these people. Now it begins to make sense. Not necessarily all of it. We're never going to see the whole picture. I think Crowley was probably involved in all kinds of things that we'll never know about. You were never supposed to know about them. But let the story tell itself. Don't try to force it to a conclusion, because then you're just going to create your own reality, which won't be real. It will just be a narrative. So it's... that's maybe something to bring here. History is a narrative, and a narrative is this sort of fancy term for what? A story. It's a story. Everything you hear about history, it's always a story. It's always a tale about describing how things work. And narratives don't necessarily mean that they're true, because narratives are usually built out of a small number of facts. And we all tend to think that facts are, they're just all over the place, but they're not. Facts are like gold. They're difficult to come. Facts are something which are real, solid, indisputable. There's not a lot of that. An example. It seems to be a fact that there was a thing called the Second World War. Right? It's a fact because there was a first one. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's going to be a second one. Don't think there was one in between. So World War II happened. Probably there's somebody somewhere who will argue that it never happened. But they're crazy. So it happened. That's a fact. Why did it happen? That's not a fact. That's an opinion. Mm. Because you can then you get it. Well, it happened for this reason and that, or for a combination. There's no single answer there. There's no clear, simple, absolute, indisputable reason as to why this war happened, even though it did. The war itself is the only fact that it existed. So what generally happens, as with this example, is that you have a fact. There was a war, and then the narrative is to explain that fact, to put it into a story where it fits. Now, the thing you can often do, based around a very few facts, is you can build completely different contradictory narratives. So if one was to set out and try to come up with every possibility as to why World War II happened, you're going to get different explanations. And those narratives can all make a certain degree of sense. Well, more or less. So it can either all be because of crazy Hitler, or there are others who will argue, no, it was all because of the insidious British who created the crazy Hitler. Okay, you ever heard that idea? Adolf Hitler was just a tool of larger forces, whatever they were. Well, all of those are trying to explain why this war happened. And you can either put Hitler at the center of it, or you can make him a minor player and put the Illuminati at the top, or whoever you want. You can build different narratives, and those narratives aren't compatible. All but one are lies. So, don't trust history. Just a bunch of narratives, most of which are lies. But that's all you got to go on.
Well, that's a good chance to transition here. You can pick either a specific agency or just the U.S. government as a whole. But I think people, we talked about this at breakfast, people are kind of, especially recently, are starting to maybe appreciate, may not be the best word for it, but recognize a lot of the lies and deceit that may have happened. Which lie or deceit do you think is the largest or most important that's been done by U.S. government, intelligence agency, whichever direction you may want to go?
Well, you could pick a lot of them. The one that first jumps to mind is the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which didn't exist in the way it was described as existing, if it existed at all. And what did that result in? Well, Vietnam War, pretty much, or the vast expansion of American presence there, because the North Vietnamese attacked us. Where were we at the time? Well, that's... So you make up a story in order to get the result. It was the story that the American public needed to have because the people need to support the war, because it's a good idea. So we'll just come up with a lie that will help them do that, which will ultimately serve what end? So, well, the end was to preserve the independence of a non-communist South Vietnam. How did that work out? And what was the price paid for everyone involved? So that's an example of the way in which, yes, this isn't just one agency. This is a whole constellation of groups working together to essentially create a fiction so that the public would get behind a war that ultimately, well, it's still debatable. But,
I don't know if it is.
which was a failure in terms of its overall policy goals. I mean, I know that you bombed a lot of stuff and killed a lot of Viet Cong, but the ultimate goal failed. Therefore, you lost. Deal with it. We did, right? That just, not that the army didn't do everything. It killed all the people it was supposed to kill, wasn't enough. So, and I think that is often kind of used to, obscure things as well. It's that the overall goal that this whole thing was fought over ended up being a failure for one reason or another, but it still won lots of battles, okay? That's like people claiming that the Confederacy won all these battles in the Civil War. Well, how did that work out? Okay, still lost. So deal with it. But that's only one. There are people who argue, and I think it's an interesting argument, that FDR ginned up, allowed Pearl Harbor to happen because we needed somebody to attack us so we can get into World War II, largely to help the British fight the Germans. But since the Germans aren't obligingly attacking us, the Japanese will do it. Now, is that a conspiracy theory, or was it an actual conspiracy within the government to allow something to happen that they knew would give a pretext for war? I'm not sure. I don't think it's an interesting question that will probably never be answered fully, but is debatable. I wouldn't put it past them. Why would one? So those are examples. Another one might be when Atomic Energy Commission was exploding atom bombs like crazy in Nevada, 100 of them, basically during the 1950s, and all those clouds of fallout were drifting over much of the interior American West, poisoning livestock and people almost certainly responsible for a rise in everything from birth defects to cancer that went on. People were aware of this at the time, the snow's glowing. They would report, there's like weird things and my animals are dying. Should I be worried about this? People from the government, men from the government would show up and go, no, there's absolutely nothing to worry about. Now, you're fine. Okay. They didn't know that. And what was going on here, it seems pretty apparent to me in that case, is that no one knew what the long-term results of exposure to atomic fallout would be. I mean, you knew what would happen if you dropped one on a city. You've done that a couple of times. But what would happen? What would be the effects of fallout? There's only one way to find out, isn't there? So let's find out. But of course, the guinea pigs can't know that they're guinea pigs. And that was just, in my estimation, deliberately done. They didn't know what the effects might be. I mean, maybe it won't have anything bad. Maybe it will, but we're just going to have to find out. Turns out some bad things did happen. Mm-hmm. But that's all in the cause of science and national security. Because we would need to know those things. Tuskegee syphilis experiments, pretty much the same thing. Got syphilis, we're gonna give you stuff to cure it, except it's not gonna cure you. It's just gonna let the disease go on so we can see what the course might be. So we'll just lie to you about that. And then try to imagine how many other times that you don't know about that has been done. So yes, it is not a one-off. It is done repeatedly. And there's always some kind of security or scientific reason being done in it. But yeah.
They like to lie.
But it's not just the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. All of them lie repeatedly about things because you're the government. You're not a person and you have no responsibility. History will absolve you or it will forget.
Now that's a powerful way to say that, but yeah, I mean, that's one of the more interesting ways to look at it is that history is written by the victor. And so really, if you want to erase yourself after you did all the negative actions, eventually, as long as you win, you can pretty much...
Even if you lose, you can rewrite the narrative so
too.
that it didn't really... I mean, I was just watching something the other day. Albert Speer, who was, Hitler's architect, at the Nuremberg trials, got 20 years as opposed to a rope. Partly because he seemed to be very sorry about the things that he'd been involved in. And Speer later went on to actually get a certain amount of respectability. Difficult to do for a Nazi war criminal, but nevertheless, he was able to manage that because he managed the narrative about himself, which was basically that I was just an architect and I got caught up in these things and it was all very heady and so on. And, mistakes were made. And I guess I was kind of on the periphery of these things, but, I didn't know all that much about it. I didn't make any of the key decisions. And people were willing to accept that. And I think it's a pretty good case that can be made and has been made is that he was thoroughly lying about Mo. He was whitewashing his own life and other people bought it because now it was okay to do that. They preferred to see him that way. He talked himself out of the hangman and he talked himself into semi-respectability by the time he died in 1981.
So this is a good tie-in because, and again, we'll get to Epstein here in a minute, but the main idea, we talked about this at breakfast, and I think Crowley is kind of like an interesting comparison as well. You look at Alex Jones, you look at Tucker Carlson, like some of these individuals that have gotten really popular lately for more like counter thought. And it seems like the idea is that people they could be used as tools to drive people away from the quote unquote truth, because people don't want to think that these bad things are true. To relate it to, in that situation there, it's that instead of believing that this guy only got 20 years and he was the mastermind or like a key player in the Holocaust, it's a lot easier to say, well, he's probably telling the truth. Like he probably didn't know, because for you, it's less scary. It seems less intimidating. if you believe those narratives versus the ones that, again, a true killer is walking among us type of thing.
Well, the other thing about it is that Speer was a personable, likable, erudite man.
Mm-hmm.
Most people who met him found him likable, and you don't. It's the odd thing about a lot of villains. Okay, I should work in a shameless plug here for the great courses I recently just did. It just came out a course on villains in history. And one of the things you find out about villains is that a lot of people get a reputation for villainy who probably didn't quite deserve it. I mean, they don't seem to be that bad, and there are other ones who really do deserve it. But it's often a system of perception management about the person. But the thing you find about a lot of them is that villains, more often than not, tend to be charming.
Mm-hmm.
They're usually, when you meet them, quite normal. Their eyes aren't spinning. There's not, flecks of spittle coming out of their mouth. They seem to be fairly normal. And it therefore becomes difficult. Well, they engage in this. They engage, their whole life is a deception. They appear to be one thing, while internally there's something else. I mean, Ted Bundy was an example of that.
One of the best.
I think it was the judge in Florida who sentenced him to death who said, hey, you actually seem like kind of a nice young man. It's kind of too bad I have to sentence you to death, and you're a psycho
said he would have
killer.
been a great lawyer.
Yeah, you would have been a great lawyer. I would have had. And that's how he was able to do these things. I mean, the brutal fact of it was, how was he able to kill all those women? Because he charmed them first before he killed them. That's something to keep in mind. The psychopath will charm before they kill.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, the world wishes to be deceived, and so it is. I don't know what much more there is to say about that.
Well, this is a perfect transition
Yeah.
point, I think, into Jeffrey Epstein. Obviously, recently we've got a lot more information, at least on the surface it appears so. But I guess before diving into all that, could you maybe detail who Jeffrey Epstein was? And for those that maybe have tried to bury their head in the sand in this topic over...
Be hard to do, but not impossible. How do you summarize Jeffrey Epstein? Jeffrey Epstein was basically a nobody. Okay, he came from a middle-class family in Brooklyn. Went to high school. The story I was told, remember, this is the story I was told, I didn't say it was a fact, okay, was that one of the things he did in high school was he was good at math. He could do calculations in his head. That's always kind of handy. I can't. I've always admired people who could. Always been slightly afraid of math people. All right. So he made money and he made friends by doing other students' math homework. I knew people who did the same type of thing. Mm-hmm. You can make friends with the jocks that way. How else can you do it? They depend upon you to. This is his whole thing. The secret to Epstein is his ingratiating himself to people at a higher station than he was. So you start out by doing the homework for the football team, so to speak, make friends there. Most people found him likable enough, seems to have done okay. He could be charming. And then he goes on from there, and he gets, the surprising thing is that without any teaching credentials or anything else, he gets a job at the Dalton School, this preppy school,
One of the
rich
best
kids
there,
with rich parents. He's teaching math and physics. Teaches there for a couple of years until his contract is, it's a question, was he fired or was his contract not renewed? Contract not renewed in the education world is usually fired.
Mm-hmm.
But, inappropriate relationship with students. Okay, we're going to see a trend here.
Hopefully not.
What does being a high school teacher give you daily access to? High school girls.
Mm-hmm.
Which he seems to be a certain trend that would continue. Now, oddly enough, he gets discharged from the school. He's not disgraced, no, because he's made friends with some of the parents. And one of those parents, whose name escapes me, but it's a real person, then gives him a job as a day trader. Works for Bear Stearns, okay? Gives him a lowly job as a day trader, and within a few years, he's now worked his way up in the company. Hobnobbing with the rich and the powerful. He managed to somehow ingratiate himself with these people, and the rest of his career goes much the same way. He eventually becomes, his great talent, apparently, as a kind of glorified accountant, was finding what were called tax mitigation, tax dodging, ways to avoid paying taxes. What will rich people pay you for that? A lot.
Mm-hmm.
Plus,
you become their best
you
friend.
become your best friends. Well, I don't know. What was it? Leslie Wexner and his recent deposition saying we weren't friends, we were just friendly. Yeah. True, I gave him a power of attorney over all my money. We were never friends.
Bet on the boat.
Make of that what you will. So he became friends or friendly with these people. And so this guy who's basically a nobody becomes a somebody through his association with somebodies. And he does this basically as a kind of servant, doing favors for them. And then, eventually you get someone like Wexner who will give him wide control over his finance because he was good at what he did with the money. The other thing he did was eventually found, I think this in the early 90s, found his own company part of whose purpose was to recover embezzled funds, funds that had been embezzled or stolen and hidden abroad. So now, if you have the techniques to discover where money has been hidden, what else do you know?
How to hide money.
How to hide money, which is what I suspect he was really doing. So now he's in the business of moving money around secretly. One of his clients is Adnan Khashoggi, who's an international arms dealer up to the very bushy eyebrows and every kind of intrigue you can come up with. Where do you get customers like that? Well, they aren't easy to come by, but they are important. And so to me, that's what's interesting about Epstein, is that he's a nobody who becomes a somebody by being this useful tool for them. So in that sense, to sort of bring him back down to the level of reality, because I think there's a lot of hyperventilation which is going on about Epstein right now. Okay, people are going through these files and they're reading this and they're coming across weird things and it's, oh my God, they're eating babies. Maybe. Okay, oh my God, they're cannibals. Maybe. But you got to put the term maybe in there, because as suspicious as all the jerky and pizza talk is, and clearly they're not talking about jerky and pizza as we know it, it is also unclear exactly what they're talking about. So this is where people are sort of beginning to create their own narratives about it. I mean, what okay, these are not facts. The fact is that the emails exist and that they're saying these things. That's it. The rest is an opinion about what those mean. Is his rise to that position. And then there are all kinds of questions. Well, what was he doing? Was this a blackmail operation? Did he have all these cameras and was he luring, innocent royals like Prince Andrew into compromising situations? Well, I think innocent royal is an oxymoron. Remember, you're dealing, I like to say, with the British royal family. All right, so I'm not sure there's anything off base for those people. There's a long history there. Most of it's sordid. So they are royal. Generally, you're compromising people who are compromisable. So I think early on, one of the things that if I sort of looked at that casually, because I can't say that, Jeffrey Epstein was paying a huge amount, that's another guy caught up in a sex scandal. And it still is. But it's not so much about him as opposed to this whole larger nexus of which he's a part, because he's not at the top of anything.
Mm-hmm. I think that's what people get confused on.
He's a servant in this situation. He's a very important servant, but he's like a chamberlain in the royal palace. He is a person of some importance and influence, but he's not really making, I think in most cases, the executive decisions. He's hiding other people's money. He's recovering money that other people have hidden. He's hobnobbing with all of these individuals and also deliberately seemingly trying to draw a lot of people into his orbit. So I don't know whether it's fair to say that just because someone's name shows up in his correspondence or he sent them an email, it means that they're one of his cronies and sacrificing virgins on the island. Could be. In many ways, trying to collect people. Now, he certainly thought he was important as time went on. What are all the various things he's into? He's more of, I think, as opposed to the person himself, who I say is on the whole a fairly sordid, narcissistic individual who perhaps developed delusions of grandeur about himself as time went on, which may have been his undoing, is that he hung out with these people enough that he thought he was one of them. Mm-hmm. I think he once made a statement is that I'm not a member of the Illuminati, but I know a few people who are, which is probably a joke, right?
Yeah.
Or not. But that could get you into trouble. You're not a member of the Illuminati, but you know some people who are, and then maybe you become, you stop being useful to them and you start being a potential problem.
And you also think that you're the one pulling the strings with let's say you have the blackmail, that you're like, well, they can't touch me because I have the blackmail. Meanwhile, you're just the middleman.
Well, they can touch you.
Yeah.
So that would, there was probably already a mechanism in place to do that once he had been admitted to a certain level of knowledge. But there were people above him. He's not at the top. He's not the spider in the center of the web. He's helping to construct that. I think that's important to understand. And I'm not certain anymore how much of a blackmail operation this was. Part of it because I haven't really shown anybody who was, that's difficult. People are going to come out and go, I was blackmailed? No, probably not. So there was some, but I'm not sure that's what the real purpose of it was. I think it was some sort of large network. He was very interested in tech people. Mm-hmm. He also seemed, he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and also one of his friends was David Rockefeller. Does that mean something? There's a name to conjure with in the conspirosphere. He made it his business to know lots of people and their business and to bring them into some kind of larger, he seems to be very good at sort of connecting people together. A person whose primary task was perhaps not so much blackmailing people as to connect person A with person B and then connect both of them with person C. Usually appealing to their own particular interests in vanity and desires, and one very simple desire is that a lot of these guys seem to like, surprisingly enough, girls, and especially young ones. Mm-hmm. That's weird. No, it's just the simplest thing that you could, it's the simple answer to that. Yeah. And if there's not that, it's drugs or boys or something else.
They don't need money too.
Okay. So. Yeah. And the other interesting thing to me is that here's a single individual who at least 3 million pages of information exists. 3 million about one person. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. There must be millions more. So what does one person have to do to generate millions and millions of emails, which are tremendously dangerous things? I think back on things that I put into email, and sometimes I shudder. Okay. Okay. Because these things are just not secret. All right. They're even worse than diaries. Diaries you can hide, emails you can't hide.
So many people have access to it as well. I mean,
Yes. Okay. It's all out there. So, and you would assume, here's the idea is that, well, you got 3 million pages going through. This must tell us everything. 3 million pages would tell you everything you would need to know about a person, right? No. The more you go through it,
more confusing.
the more confusing it becomes. You can't, you thought you knew one thing, but now it seems to be something else. And you still don't know what the jerky is. Mm-hmm. Because it's the thing that I found is often the case when you begin to, the more material you collect on something, the more information you have, the picture tends not to become more clear. It becomes more obscure. Because you're just adding more and more data points to it. And sometimes they connect and sometimes they don't. You solve one mystery and you reveal two. That's just the way the damn thing works for some reason. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a kind of, as we speak, there's a kind of Epstein hysteria going on. And by that, I think people are reacting to things without necessarily thinking about them very clearly. They are creating narratives like there is no tomorrow with relatively few facts to go on. So I think the facts are Jeffrey Epstein existed. He became a significant minion to the rich and powerful. He was an entirely unscrupulous and perhaps, depending on how you want to define that slippery term, evil person. Okay? Nothing unique in any of this. He was a bad guy. But what exactly he was involved in, to what extent, how all of these different pieces fit together, we don't know yet. Give it time. And here is where going through the information that exists carefully, having more than one person looking at it, trying to share insights. Go about this thing systematically. Just don't go in and read weird things and start freaking out about them. Okay? Because that's not going to get you to the answer. And maybe there is no clear answer in it, but at least that will become determined after a while. Mm-hmm. Jeffrey Epstein he's not the tip of the iceberg. He isn't even the iceberg. But he is probably a not insignificant, but also a not central player in a much larger system of corruption and influence and power, which is ultimately what it's about. So I don't know. Should we be surprised by the fact that there are a lot of very powerful, possibly sociopathic rich people who tend to run things? No. Haven't you always suspected that anyway? Yeah. I think it's kind of shocking to see that, that some of that appears to be true. So the truth, to what extent it will ever be known, and I don't think all of it will ever be known, because there are people working, again, as we speak, to make sure it's not known. Look, you got 3 million pages released. You know how long those things have been out there? The amount of time that other people have had time to go through it and remove things? You're not getting everything. You are always getting what it is you have been allowed to see.
Now that's probably what's making me the most fearful of this, is that they're allowing us to see what we're seeing now. And so this is kind of what you're saying, like people run away with it, where they're like, if this is what we're getting, how much worse is the rest of it?
And you could even argue they acted really reluctant and hesitant to give all that material out. Oh yeah, if you insist, we'll give it to you. Well, maybe, just maybe, that was the whole, just make you anxious for it, make you beg for it, and then seem to be magnanimous when we give you what we want to give you. the truth or a truth? Will all of that help form, things like jerky and pizza could be, this is one of the questions a friend of mine raised. And it had occurred to me, but he said it first. He goes, I wonder what it is all this Epstein stuff is actually distracting us from. Because to him, this seemed like a huge distraction that everybody was paying attention to when you should really be paying attention to something else. Mm-hmm. But no one's noticing because they're all trying to figure out what jerky is. Maybe.
So let me ask then, I think a lot of people love to immediately jump to, and I don't know if this is just in the interest of hoping that's, again, somebody's steering the ship or somebody we know is steering the ship. They want to immediately jump to, is it a Mossad operation? Is it a CIA operation? Honestly, the more I've looked into it, the more I push away from that idea, and more so that, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, is that I think in their own way, there is something akin to Illuminati, such a large word to use for that, but essentially an industry above Epstein.
Well, I think one of the best ways I ever heard that described, and I think we're talking about the same thing, is that a power above state level.
Yes.
So we tend to think that governments are at the top of everything. Governments composed of presidents and prime ministers and foreign ministers and some sort of legislative bodies. Okay. That's it. That's as high as. So is there some level of authority? It was some years back, there were some other historians and I who were doing, and we were doing work with, well, it actually revolved around a fellow that I've written another book about, Sidney Riley, who's sometimes called the ace of spies, which he wasn't. He's sometimes called the model for James Bond, which he most definitely wasn't. So most of everything you said is BS. Okay, it's a real person, but not anything like that. Again is this whole sort of narrative, like a false narrative, which has been created. A topic for another time. And we would keep looking at these various, and he's kind of like Epstein in the sense that he's becomes this kind of international fixer. And so he's always kind of the middleman in things. And it's never quite clear whether it's just his own agenda he's serving or someone else's. And we're looking at these things, and it was always generally assumed that he's somehow working for the British. And yet, if you looked at these things in terms of, if by the British you mean the British government, it didn't seem to be working that way. You haven't seemed to be working against it. And it wasn't clear that governments were necessary. The governments appeared to be sort of tools in this process, but not really in control of it. So we came up with this term that we call Factor X. Okay, is there something else at work here? Is there some other power structure which isn't governmental that is at work? And is that whose interests are being served? Now, we never were able to define that, or the closest you could come up with is, well, here's an interesting term. Riley would use on occasion the term he called the occult octopus. I like that.
Yeah.
Should be a title of something. And what he seemed to be talking about, this is a guy who was in the middle of a lot of international business, mostly sort of business intrigue, was that it was the nexus of money, political power, mostly money, and business interests. That was the occult octopus, the sort of hidden octopus with all of its tentacles that existed outside the visible or legal means of power. Now, there's also a French muckraking journalist in the 20s and the 30s by the name of Roger Menevet, who came up with another, he called it the international oligarchy. I think they're kind of talking about the same thing. So as if this idea hasn't come up before. Now, that gets spun in a number of ways. So there are those who will argue, well, the minute you mention international bankers or anything like this, you're immediately talking about Jews. So it then becomes the international Jewish conspiracy. No, it doesn't, unless you want it to be. Okay, is that the first thing that comes up in your mind when the term is mentioned? Well, that's what you've been primed to expect. It doesn't mean that there aren't Jews and other people involved in it, but there's a way of, it comes back into what the whole simple purpose of conspiracy is. And we have to bring the C word in here. Because sometimes that's treated as if that's mythological. Okay, there are no conspiracies. People never conspire. It's all just a bunch of theories, and all theories are false. Are they? Okay. A theory is just a hypothesis, basically. It's a narrative you come up to try to explain things. Sometimes they're true, sometimes they're false. It all depends. But conspiracy, which is, this is my modified definition, but I think it fits, I like it, is simply two or more people working together secretly, there's the key point, in order to attain a common end. Now, legally, often the terms illegal end or unlawful end. Doesn't have to be. Who said it has to be unlawful? Two or more people working together secretly, that is without the knowledge or participation of others, to achieve something that they want. When you think of it that way, that describes most human interaction. Conspiracy comes natural to people. How many people have had an experience sitting on committees? You know that the larger a committee becomes, the less it achieves.
Yes.
Okay. Why? Because you just have to listen to more people's stupid opinions. So, or brilliant opinions. But the more people you involve in any kind of decision-making process, the more difficult it is to make any decisions. Because everybody who gets invited to the meeting thinks they have something to say about it. And then God knows, give them a vote. And then you got another problem. So how do you get things done? You reduce the decision-making down to as few people as possible. You cut most people out because they just become an obstacle to the common end. So once you and your associates have reached a goal you wish to achieve, the easiest way to do that is in isolation. You don't go out and involve the public or the government or, God forsake, Congress or anything like that into it. You just figure out a way to do it, and you get your friends like, Jeffrey Epstein to help you do it. And that probably, the operative term here is probably, because we don't know for certain, is a description as how the world actually works. So I think there probably is a factor X. There probably is some, the Illuminati has become a kind of joke. It's kind of funny.
It's in pop culture.
It's in pop culture. So, and you always imagine them as people in robes doing things where they probably wouldn't have that except at special meetings. But that's also interesting that it's been introduced, but it's been turned into a joke that no one takes seriously. Now, that's either because it is a joke and you shouldn't take it seriously, or it is very seriously, but now it's being presented as a joke, so you want. How many different ways can you twist this around? Endlessly. I mean, the things you can do with words. This again brings us back into the realm of the occult. Words, every word spoken is a spell. Words cast spells. What are spells? Things that are meant to influence, to bedazzle people, to make them think in a certain way. And what else do words do? What do lawyers do in trials? They cast spells over the jury. They create competing narratives, only one of which can be true. But on that, the guilt or innocence or life or death of a particular person is involved. And so a skillful lawyer or a more skillful lawyer will cast a better spell. He will mesmerize the jury or the judge into seeing reality. Remember this whole thing we went to? Bend reality. Mm-hmm. The best way to bend reality, the simplest form of magic is words. Casting a spell through the narrative, that's control history's narrative. It's a spell which is created, which then defines the reality that people have. It's almost as if, the magical idea that you can speak things into existence. I think the saying was that a witch always speaks of what she or he wants as if it has already happened, making things get in conformity with will. And that's what happens all the time. That's what newspaper columnists, I don't know, maybe that's what we're doing now, but is using words. But words are very powerful. They cast spells over people's minds. Mm-hmm. And part of it is to sometimes admit that something exists, but then turn it into a meme. Turn it into a comical image that no one will then take seriously, when that's exactly what it is they should be taking seriously.
Make it so approachable that you're no longer scared of it.
Yeah. The Illuminati are fun.
So you mentioned an interesting idea. You were relating the Illuminati, and then you passively mentioned this on one of the podcasts that I was listening to, and I was like, oh, please pull out that string, where you mentioned how interesting it was that the ideology of the Illuminati there is we're going to create a one world government, and then you'll see that tied into things like communism, like Bolshevism. Can't say that word. Bolshevism. You'll see that tied into Marxist goals, for example, where they're looking to create a one world government. Like it's almost like the idea we're saying here, where the Illuminati can change titles, but the goal will always be the same. And it seems like there's a consistent thread being pulled throughout history there, where that would probably be where to keep your eye on. Who is maintaining that type of goal?
Well, if you go back to the real Illuminati, okay, the factual Illuminati, the Bavarian Illuminati that Adam Weishaupt, who was a Jesuit-trained lawyer, back in the 1770s, same time as the American and French Revolution, that same sort of period. And Weishaupt had rather grandiose goals for his organization. And again, it was to create a new world order, a new elite, largely recruited out of the old elite that were renamed. So it's interesting that the people that Weishaupt wanted as Illuminati were not peasants and working men and craftsmen. You could care less about those people. Those are just, to what might be termed the elite. I think most of us are just, in video game terms, NCPs. That's all. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's all common people are. They're just objects. They're just things that we manipulate. We're not trying to serve their interests. Their interests really don't exist to us. But so Weishaupt, if you look at of the members of the Bavarian Illuminati that we know, and I think there are about 400 or 500 that have been identified. Sometimes they identified themselves. That is, people who were definitely members of the organization. There were others you can suspect, but you're not sure of. That a large percentage of them are nobles. Okay, there are princes and dukes. Okay, all right, you're already at the top of the food chain in the 18th century. You're already a prince. What more do you want? Okay. As the saying goes, how much better can you eat? What is it that you can't buy, that you can't already afford? Well, that's not how he appealed to them. His appeal to these people was in terms, you'll be part of a new elite. You'll be part of a kind of spiritual or intellectual elite. And therefore, he could attract into this organization members of the aristocracy who are now joining an organization whose ultimate goal is the annihilation of all existing governments and religions. That is, an annihilation of the very aristocracy
They're a part.
which you're a part of. Why would you do that? Okay. Well, it's the same kind of question that could be asked later in the 20th century as to why people who were members of the capitalist class would become communists. Why would you then join a political movement whose very aim is the annihilation of the social class you come from? Well, because, there's nothing like growing up in a social class to make you hate it. Okay. Nobody knows how despicable and degenerate the rich are than the people. Okay, arguably. So, people often have problems with their influence or with their families or something else. And yes, they can be recruited. I mean, that's one of the things I've come across as to how many Bolsheviks are actually pretty good businessmen. Trotsky would have been a hell of a capitalist. Mm-hmm. Okay, he knew how to organize things. I mean, if you can organize the Red Army, you could organize a company. There was a story that Trotsky, who becomes one of the key figures in the Bolshevik Rebellion, when he was in the U.S. before going back to Russia in 1917, there was a story, unfortunately not true, that he was an extra in a movie in which he played a Russian revolutionary. It's not him. I wish it was. Really wish that story was true. But there was this whole idea that, Trotsky becomes an extra in a movie and then he gets invited out to Hollywood and misses the revolution because he goes on to become an executive in a movie company, and instead of Metro Goldwyn Mayer, it's Metro Trotsky Mayer, and he goes on to be a movie mogul. In some alternate universe, that type of.
True.
But he would have had the capability of doing that. Lenin might have been pretty good at it as well. Just think of the things that Stalin could have done as a CEO. So, which he was.
They have no problem
basically.
firing people.
Soviet Union was a giant corporation. So it's often people can seemingly be recruited into movements that offer them a higher goal, which are otherwise completely contrary to their existing social position. I mean, this goes right back. Okay, you got Karl Marx, and then you got Friedrich Engels. Okay, what's the importance of Engels in this? Engels pays for Marx. Marx is financed by Engels. Where does Engels' family money come from? From textile mills. So it is from the money of the capitalist exploitation of textile workers that goes to pay Karl Marx to write a book about the evils of the exploitation of workers. Okay. That communism, for the very root, is financed by the very thing that it opposes. It's a weird world that we live in. So Weishaupt sort of created, he recruited people in the elite to be a new elite by promising them all kinds of things. And that's it. We first of all, we have to wipe aside the existing order. We have to get rid of this whole exist system. And then we're going to build a new rational one run by the right people. Although pretty much that's run by him. Because within it, there's always, as you advanced in the Illuminati, you thought you were at the top. Well, it turns out there are some levels above that you weren't told about. So you're never actually in control. So who's actually in control? Adam Weishaupt, as far as I can figure out, which some of his fellow Illuminati seem to have figured out and got a little miffed over. Mm-hmm. But that organization is never destroyed. Okay, it's banned in Bavaria, I think on 4 separate occasions. Bavarian government bans it, and then bans it again, then bans it again, then bans it again. What does that tell you?
They were dangerous.
Banning, well, it also means that banning things doesn't work.
Yeah, too.
Okay, they just change their name. The other thing is that we don't even know what the name of the organization is. So Illuminati simply means those who have been enlightened. It's a term which has been used at least since the Roman era and was even used by early Christians because they'd been enlightened to the gospel. So it's not unique. It means only that you have been enlightened. It does not define what you have been enlightened to. And there's at one point where Weishaupt said something like, our order never be known anywhere by its real name, which has always suggested to me that the real name isn't the order of the Illuminati. That it's something else, which is never spoken, is only known at the highest levels. So when you're talking about the Illuminati, chances are they're not the Illuminati. That was never any more than a cover name. Maybe it has no name. It is simply an understanding among us that the organization exists. We don't have to give it a name. It can be anything. So when you keep that in mind, that you don't even know exactly what you're talking about, that it has no specific name, that it is never destroyed, that Weishaupt himself lives until at least, I think, 1830, 1833, continues to regularly correspond. Does the movement, I mean, did everybody just decide that, we're tired of this Illuminati thing, let's go do something
gave it a
else.
good shot.
We got bored, let's go do something else? Or did it, under one or more names, continue to mutate and evolve? And this is why, by the time we get to the early 20th century, you have the emergence of communism, which, in a different sense, has basically the same goals. The sweeping aside of all existing political and religious order and the replacement by one world system governed by an enlightened elite, the party. Different name, same thing. So is that a coincidence?
I would say not. That's kind of why I wanted to leave. Well, because that ties me right back to the Epstein thing where, again, a lot of people love to lean in on Mossad, CIA. And I guess this would tie into a secondary question here. But I think when you look at these secret societies, and again, in the way that you just laid it out, doesn't necessarily have to have a name, doesn't necessarily even need to be a society where we meet on Tuesdays and we
it don't need robes.
It can be a pattern of who you know. The thing is the way the CIA operates, maybe if you could break this down for people, like they operate somewhat akin to a secret society where there's this area knows about this area knows about this, but they don't know about each other. It's a positive, but it also makes it relatively easy to infiltrate if you are an Illuminati type entity where you want to be able to get in with the powerful and the people within the CIA while also kind of keeping your cover. Do you know what I'm trying to say there? I think there's
Well, if you wanted to infiltrate into an organization, one of the key places you'd have to control is not the person at the top. You wouldn't need to become the director. You'd need to be the person who runs HR.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the people who does the hiring and the firing, because that's the way that you get your people in and guide them around. So the powers would be exercised that way. Any intelligence agency, basically, at least, well, it either is a bureaucratic secret society or it mimics one in the sense that it passes certain litmus tests. You have to be recruited. You just don't walk in and go, I want to work for the CIA. Okay. It's usually not that easy. You're vetted. Okay, you're generally checked out. You have to check out, make sure that you're suitable, make sure that you're worthy to be a member. And then once you do get in, there are certain tests, initiations you're subjected to. And then if you make it that far, you're sworn to secrecy. You know, the key element in a secret society, remember, isn't that no one knows about it. Usually people are aware of it. But that you are sworn to secrecy about what the organization does. Once you're in it, you don't talk about it. And keeping your mouth shut is a very important part of intelligence work. So I think that also creates a kind of, arguably, an insular attitude, almost a kind of monastic attitude about the organization itself as being a kind of separate entity. Similar to what it was also in the 18th century that many people within the Catholic Church feared about the Jesuit order and why it was banned for decades, because it was feared that it had become a church within a church, that it was a separate thing doing its own kind of agenda. And in that sense, because of the secret society characteristics, the insularity of it, and the secrecy which goes with it. Intelligence agencies. If you wanted to pick a part of any government that could go rogue in a way, or can do things that are more unaccountable, that's who you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you wanted to, you know, there was some sort of class I was in years ago, and we all had to pretend to be different people in the government and hold different offices. And even at the time, I knew that I did not want to be the prime minister or the foreign minister. I wanted to be the head of the secret police. Well, the security agency. There you go. Why? Because that was the fun thing to do. But that is you often have to look around carefully to figure out where the center of power is. And the center of power is seldom at the top. It's somewhere below. People who make key decisions about who gets what position, people who can place other people in that situation. So that again goes back to Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati. What did he tell his Illuminati to do? Go join Masonic lodges. That's what we're all going to do. He became a Freemason. He ordered everybody else to become Freemasons. Go join those lodges and take them over and turn them to our purposes. Now, why? He said, well, Masonic lodges are common and relatively familiar, and people don't think much about them. Nobody's afraid of them. Often people think they're kind of goofy and snooty, so they're perfect. No one is going to pay much attention to them, and so we will operate. Our order with no name, will take over another order and turn it to our purposes. He's certainly not the first person then or since who's thought of that.
So, tying it back with Epstein, so obviously Ghislaine, and we can kind of talk on her and her background and her father's background as well. There's just a lot of tie-ins here with intelligence agencies, and I think that's why people are so quick to jump on. It was the CIA, it was Mossad. But irregardless, no matter who it is, I feel like personally, and I'd be interested to hear your opinion on this, and obviously we're theorizing, I don't think Epstein was the first, nor do I think he's going to be the last that's conducting whatever it is this operation was.
Epstein has almost certainly already been replaced. He's been replaced for some time. What exactly has he been replaced as? That's the question. But there is a nexus that he is a part of. That's the one thing. And there are people who are just sort of casually recruited into this. There are others who are part of it. Most people at different levels are being used. This is another thing. There's almost always some level higher than what you're in. You know, Prince Andrew thought maybe he was at the highest level. Certainly he's not. Mm-hmm. Okay, he can be sacrificed as well. Epstein, could be sacrificed. So someone else is doing the same sort of thing. Ghislaine Maxwell is interesting because she comes from a kind of, spy family. I mean, her father certainly had connections to Mossad, which meant that he cooperated with them on some level. But this is the type of thing. Cooperation is a strategy. It's not friendship. I mean, sometimes there might be a common interest between opposing intelligence agencies to cooperate on something. They'll do that if it's to their mutual interest. Maybe there's some sort of other potential threat to both of them that they both agree upon that they should cooperate to neutralize. Doesn't mean they ever stop being enemies. It just means that they can cooperate in that sphere. Here again, if you wanted to look at a simple historical example, the Great Allied Alliance during World War II. Well, the only thing that Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin had in common was that they were at war with Hitler. Nazi Germany was a common threat to them. Doesn't mean they ever liked each other. Mm-hmm. They never trusted each other, and they spied on each other the whole time. Okay, they never stopped plotting and scheming in an attempt to undermine the other. They just had a different agenda at that point. So Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell comes onto the scene, and she probably connected him to other things. Very smart woman. Well, I didn't say good. Those are two different things. Epstein also was saying just because you have a high IQ doesn't make you a good person. I think he knew something about that. But did she tie him into things that her father had been a part of? See, I don't see intelligence agencies specifically controlling this situation. I think they're also just other aspects of it. Pawns. They wouldn't like that term, but that's a part of it. That there is some level above this type of thing. I know, Illuminati again. But
Yeah.
there is no Illuminati. Well, in a way, isn't it almost logical that there would be?
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
if you can conceive of it, then again, you're kind of halfway to. I mean, the whole thing could become, maybe human beings just aren't organized to do that. But I mean, here's the thing that actually kind of concerns me. Not so much that there is some Illuminati-like group, but that they're just a larger and more, more self-obsessed group of, they're like Congress, equally incompetent. Not that they actually run the world, but they think that they should, and they imagine that they do. And they just run around carrying on all of their little schemes and plots, which are mostly to make people within it rich and betray each other constantly and think they're running the world when they're not. Because maybe there's some level even above them. Maybe that's the question we should ask. If the Illuminati are the level above statecraft, what's the level above them? Aliens? No, we're not going to go there because there are no aliens. But
Maybe next
this is a game that you can play a lot. But yeah, that's the idea. You'd like to think that if Dr. Evil is running the world, that Dr. Evil, he's evil, but at least he's competent. At least there's some sort of malicious logic which is operating there, as opposed to just it's the again, the Gnostics sort of, the demiurge, the incompetent God, the God that thinks he runs things, but he really doesn't. And, just does things like create ticks and 200 species of parrots because he can. Okay. Has no particular, and this is why the whole world doesn't make, this is the explanation, why the world doesn't make sense, because it was the creation of an incompetent screw-up God who's crazy. And, let's hope that the head of the Illuminati has more sense than that.
Well, when you look at it, I mean, again, and, I'd be interested in hearing kind of more how the release of these emails maybe has shifted your mindset. But for me, it's pushed me further in that direction because, the common, again, arguments like maybe he was out there selling the information and he was just a great businessman and like you figured out he could do this. But again, if you're the CIA and you're buying information off of this guy and you know that clearly he's selling you that such and such individual, here's a blackmail photo, whatever it may be. If I'm the CIA, I'm looking at that and saying, you need to be one of ours because you can't be giving this to other people. We need to make sure that we have this locked down. Mossad would do the same thing. KGB would do the same. Like any agency is going to recognize the power behind this. So the fact that he was so intertwined with so many different ones makes me think that they all knew they were playing for the same team. Now, what does the same team look like? That's open for interpretation. But that's what this release and more digging I've done in that, it's pushed me more in that direction, that there is an entity that's playing a different game.
Yeah, I don't think he was the tool of any one intelligence agency. I'd be more inclined to think that they too are tools, possibly customers. I mean, it's hard to see why all of the. Well, that's one of the questions. Do we have actual photographs or stills of important people in compromising situations. I mean, we know there were cameras everywhere. Where are the tapes? And I'm not sure that itself. Now, you've got Andrew sort of hovering weirdly.
Yeah, all the pictures they've released have just been weird.
Yeah. It could be, they're definitely suspicious. But there should just be reams and reams and reams and reams of orgies. Isn't that what we expect? Mm-hmm. Okay. The whole thing should be like some bacchanal taking place. And does that exist? Does it ever exist? Or all you need is the implication that it exists? Man, I don't think he collected this for his own particular enjoyment. It was for some potential purpose, but doesn't mean it's not there. But I don't see much hard evidence of an actual active blackmail operation going on. That would be a little, because most of the victims aren't going to come forward. The tapes might be hidden away. That was probably, I would suspect, more potential leverage than anything else. It wasn't what the business was about, but it was a kind of protection in some way. There's a guy named Trevor Moore, or there was a guy named Trevor Moore. I think it was part of this comedy group, Whitest Kids You Know. Mm-hmm. Who I never paid any attention to, but there's you can find this on YouTube if you're interested, and it's a whole thing where of his recruitment into the Illuminati, and yes, they're wearing red robes, and they're going through you have to sign this blood oath, of course, if you betray this, we'll murder you and everyone you love, and then we'll also need something else from you. We'll need a compromising photograph between you and a minor. Okay, this was done years ago, by the way. And he goes, is that something I can do on my own? Are you going to arrange that? We prefer that it be done here. And we planted a little explosive device in your heart. So this whole idea is, if you want to achieve success, this is how it's. And of course, it's all done by a comedy group as a joke. And I think the robes are a little over the top. But I thought that was an interesting thing to include. Yeah, we'll need you in a compromising position with a minor. Photographic evidence of that. So there is much more to be learned about Mr. Epstein. Whether we will learn it or not is the question. I'd say don't get your hopes up.
I'd say so too.
Again, there's been a lot of time for things to be. I'm sure other people looked at this and will continue to do so. And I'm also very leery that much of what is being looked at is a distraction.
So I have two ways that I'm going in that direction. Is I guess first to go on that. The other indication, I don't think it was necessarily CIA or Mossad or anything, is the way that this administration has handled the whole situation, whether it's, again, Trump fully could be shown in these documents. They're obviously, that's the thing. Like you're saying, we're getting released information that's basically coming from the source. They can tell us whatever they want to tell us. But my biggest surprise was someone like Kash Patel, and I know I mentioned this morning, where for a year on the road, he was saying, day one I get in, getting all those documents, I'm releasing them. I know for a fact Epstein didn't kill himself. And then as soon as he gets in the office, and this is what a lot of people say, is like some conversation clearly happened, because he immediately flips his tune, says, no, he fully killed himself. No, I haven't seen any emails. And then all of a sudden the emails appear out of nowhere and they have to release them. It seems like there's just a lot of conversation behind closed doors that, again, if it's a CIA operation, I feel like an administration doesn't come in this scared's like the wrong word, but just they don't shift the narrative this rapidly, if that makes sense. And I guess what was your view on seeing like how quickly this just flipped as soon as they got in?
Well, one, you've got politicians or aspirant politicians making promises about things that they're going to do that, oddly enough, they turn around and they don't do. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Okay. Promises, promises, promises. It's just the whole thing. If you do what you said you're going to do, then what's your next? Okay. What are you going to? Where's your next bread and the circuses? If you give the bread and circuses away. I don't find that the flip flop seems not unusual in the general realm of politics. The kind of nakedness of it, usually it's done with a little more finesse in some way. Now, I don't know. I mean, maybe Patel believed one thing and then came in. And so what other evidence do you see to convince him? I mean, is there a photograph? I mean, is there camera footage of Epstein actually hanging himself? Well, then why don't we see that? Why doesn't somebody see it? It's not, again, there's no fact to go on. There's a lot of opinion. I mean, we don't even know if he's dead. Okay. I think probably he is. But could this whole thing have been? I mean, look, Epstein at one point offered to put up $100 million in bail so he could stay out of jail. So would a guy who could put up $100 million in bail, could he possibly have the means to fake his death? Yeah.
And the connections to do
and
so.
the connections to do it. I mean, the guy, let's put it this way, he was well connected and he had access to a lot of money. So if anybody could have done it, not to say that he did, and that may be a lesser possibility, but it isn't one. So, not 100% sure that he's actually dead. Or if he is dead, whether he killed himself or someone else killed him. He's just not around anymore. See, that's the fact. He's not around anymore. Apparently dead. Probably as Jeffrey Epstein, he doesn't exist anymore, but you don't know. We think we know a lot of things. Mostly we believe stuff, and that's not the same thing. When you believe something, you just adopt it as your kind of operative paradigm and you build your life around it. It can be a total lie. It works. A lot of them work perfectly well. What we know, that's not too much, is it?
Every time we think we know something, too, it seems like, I mean, I told you in the car, I was like, the Epstein thing I've been on for years now. But the emails were the first time I was like, it really could have been, again, it's all, there's no definitive proof at this point, but it all could have been as crazy as people like Alex Jones were saying for years. Like, there's that potential. And it's always weird to kind of recognize that stuff that years ago you might have thought was outlandish has a possibility.
I don't know. I know a guy who has a T-shirt he made himself that said Alex Jones is right about everything. Or actually was right about everything. I don't know what that... That's a frightening prospect, isn't it? But probably some things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what you got to keep in mind here, from just an average citizen standpoint, and if you're an investigator standpoint, is that there's a lot of reason to feed you false information. Epstein already has demonstrably compromised and ruined some important people. I don't know how important a prince is, but anyway, got him into a lot of trouble. Others as well. People's careers or reputations are being ruined merely by the fact that they show up in the emails, that he had any kind, the guy is poison at this point. You want to have no contact with him at all. So there's undoubtedly a fair amount of counter pressure, and there always has been, to hold this material back. Millions of pages have been released, and more will be. Again, I would caution that since we don't know how many pages there are to begin with, we don't know where all of this information is, anything that appears is just whatever it is that the brownies have left for you. All right. The little archival brownies have found this stuff, and they've just left it in the kitchen for you to find in the morning. You don't know what it is that the brownies might have removed, or here's the other thing to consider about information, may have been inserted.
Exactly.
Remember, just as Cleve Baxter would have pointed out in 1949, it's not just about erasing memories, it's about creating memories of things that never happened. So, how much of these documents are authentic? Is this another kind of narrative which is being created with all kinds of tantalizing, creepy clues about jerky and pizza and grape soda being thrown in to attract everyone's attention? The one thing that seems apparent is that within Epstein's circle, within the group that he had assembled, who he's sharing these communications with, that they're speaking in a code. None of these things mean what they are. And they're speaking this way, presumably because, again, they want to keep others out of the process. They have something to hide. They can't talk about what they're talking about directly or use its actual name. So there is a certain deception against anyone who may be reading them. Or there was one person who argued, well, this is all just a bunch of bros who are just using these kind of code words with each other just because it's kind of a cool thing to do. It's a frat boy thing. I don't think that adequately explains it. Mm-hmm. No, I think they were well aware of the fact that if they talked openly about these things under their real name, it would possibly be criminal. So they're not. Now, does that mean that they're all cannibals and they're eating babies? I don't think there's sufficient evidence to really... I know people are going, Spence, you're being way too cautious. You're trying to whitewash Jeffrey Epstein. No, I'm not. Okay. I already said he was a creep.
Yeah.
That is fairly evident.
I think the
very rich,
stuff.
Influential creep. But don't become... Whatever it is that's going on here, it's not just about baby eating, even if that was going on. That, again, is only part of another picture. It's about power, and it's about influence. It seems to be influence that, again, flows at a level above or underneath. It's the occult octopus, which is at work. That's what I think Jeffrey Epstein was a part of, if it exists.
See, that kind of follows up too with what my, again, recent thoughts, as you said, like one of your friends mentioned that what is the list distracting us from, or what are these emails distracting us from? And you mentioned pawns here a couple of times, like looking at agencies. It seems like the names that are getting released are the ones they're okay burning. They're okay with Prince Andrew getting burnt. They're okay with Bill Clinton because realistically here soon, those power players are going to be off the board, irregardless. And this is kind of why I asked the question of the new Epstein, is that if you're intelligence agency, you're a higher up, deeper state, right now you have an opportunity to reset the board, essentially. You say, what are some pieces we're going to pull over to our new area, and who are we going to burn, and make sure that we're focusing on the next generation of influential individuals. And that's kind of where I've been leaning, where I'm thinking a lot of politicians are their way out the door. They're older, they're no longer going to be as relevant. The new generation of tech billionaires, they're coming up. So if I'm in that position now, that's where my mind would be, saying, we'll let them have this, because right now we need to focus on.
We'll throw some people under the bus, people that are disposable. Prince Andrew, certainly.
It was an easy one.
Pretty easy. So, look, he's very important. Now he's not a prince anymore. Look what happened. The guilty have been punished. Now, everybody go away. There's nothing more to see. Bill Clinton, well, he already had kind of a slightly tarnished reputation to begin with. So, nobody will raise much of a stink about that. Or his wife.
And they had their time in power, too.
They had their time in power, now they're done. All right, so it's There might even be those who argue that, once you've joined the Illuminati, that's one of the things you agree to do. Okay, if you have to take a fall, you take it and you keep your mouth shut because there are worse alternatives. So you can spin this thing so many ways. Yes, to the extent this organization exists, there is a new Epstein or someone who has taken over that role. He probably wasn't the first person who was in it. Or the organization goes on. The organization is it's an egregore. Ever run across that term? It's another occult. See, keep working this back in. An egregore is a collective spirit. All right, it's the type of thing that a group of people, it's like your collective spirit that you imagine and then becomes real, a thought form that achieves a certain degree of, it's like create your own demon. So if enough people believe in this and they feed energy into it, they create an egregore. They create something which is a kind of being, an actual consciousness that reflects back what all of those thoughts are reflecting into it. And an order of some kind, I'm not necessarily talking about an occult order, becomes a kind of organizational egregore, something which is more than simply the sum of its members, which exists through the efforts of all of those members, but which is not dependent upon any one of them. So any parts of it, even many parts of it, can be individually sacrificed, but which has a kind of life and energy and will all its own. The will of the organization is different than the will of the people within it. The Illuminati as an organization is bigger than the Illuminati, the group of people who were there.
So tying back in just from the even beginning, you mentioned some of the images that have come out with Epstein stuff and just in general, very, like we said, weird. It hasn't been necessarily as dark as, some of the emails or just what people like to theorize. But there has been levels of occult implementation or satanic aspects to it. Why do you think that there is that level of time? Do you think it's more of separation from the things that they're doing, or is there a bit of a tie-in of the mindset that comes from it? Like how is that all kind of working there?
Well, is it play acting or is it real? That's always a question. But good acting is very convincing. So there's a certain type of magic when a good actor is someone who can convince us that they are not themselves. And we all know it's Daniel Day-Lewis, but they're playing they are being possessed by this other person to the point that we willingly, willing suspension of disbelief, even though we know this is an actor and nothing in this is real, that we accept it as real and we emotionally react to it. When the character dies, we're sad, even though that character never existed to begin with. That, I would argue, is a form of magic. There is actually a spell which has been cast. It's a way of thinking about it. Every movie is a ritual that you participate in. So I think there's a whole realm. Well, we keep coming back to this question of what's real and what's imitation. And it's the appeal of what could be roughly called Satanism is simply, in some ways, the appeal of the other. And I think it's for people who don't think that they've gotten a good deal from God. What's your next alternative?
The other guy.
Okay, the devil. Okay, who will always tell you that, look, I'm the good guy. Okay, what we have here are competing narratives. So this goes back to the whole different ways, one of the Gnostic readings of, I don't know why Gnostics keep coming up, but they always do, of the whole Garden of Eden story, myth, reality, however you want to see it. All right. So who's the hero in this story? Well, they'll argue the serpent is. Mm-hmm. Why the serpent? Because the serpent was the only one telling them the truth. Okay. So you've been given, this is a setup. This is a setup of all times. Okay, you're told, okay, you can eat everything in the garden, but see these 2 trees over here? You don't eat off of those. Let me point them out again, okay, that you're not supposed to eat from those or terrible things will happen. Well, you eat from one, tree of knowledge, and apparently you gain some sort of awareness you didn't have before, like one, we're all naked, okay? But nothing terrible happens. And so everybody go, yeah, I told you, this is it. Now, the other one, the tricky one here is the tree of life. You eat of that, you'll become immortal. You'll become just like the god or gods, because it's a plural originally. You'll become just, and you can go through Genesis and read it. It says, oh no, we cannot let the man reach out his hand and eat of the tree of life, or he will become like us. We can't let that happen. It's a conspiracy, all right? All the Elohim are going, oh, we made these things and we put them in the terrarium and why did we put the tree? I don't know. Why did you put the tree there if you didn't want them to eat it? Okay. Unless they were supposed, you can read this. So textually, it just doesn't make a lot of sense, but nevertheless, so the serpent is the one who's trying to liberate them. And what is the key gift that he is trying to give to them? Immortality, godhood. What is the great work of alchemy? It's not turning lead into gold. It is immortality. What is it that all of the tech bros today are searching for so desperately? What is the whole idea of the down, what they want to do is turn themselves into video game characters. They want the idea of human intelligence transcending biological limitations. Immortality. Until someone pulls the plug. I should point that out. Just one wire snip away from death. So, but nevertheless, that's what it's alchemy. And this pervades a lot of the tech realm. It is a search for the alchemical goal of eternal life and godhood. This is the whole idea, is that why can't we figure out how the world works? Because we don't live long enough. See, again, we're cheated. Just as we begin to figure things out, as soon as we figure out that most of what we learned is bullshit, we die, okay? And we never have to get beyond that in some way. They might have a point there, but it's, if God cannot give me this satisfaction, then I'll seek it from the only other kind of alternative. And this is why you often get, in literature and so on, that the devil is seen as this almost kind of rebellious, liberating force. Mm-hmm. So I think there's that kind of appeal to it. That, well, let's see what the other side will offer. And, Satan seems to place much fewer rules on things. How you achieve that is pretty much up to you. If you have to do some unpleasant things, well, that's just a value judgment.
Playing on the game.
So, see, I'm open-minded and I have your best interest at heart. Okay. I am the much better alternative, speaking figuratively here. So there's that kind of appeal to it. There's, talking about an interesting character I knew years ago when I was an undergrad was a fellow who was a defrocked Catholic priest. All right. He'd been kicked out of the priesthood, kicked out of the Jesuits, because he had a whole problem with the celibacy thing. So he and his wife, who was a former nun, okay, but he was still, even though the church had kicked him out, he was still very loyal to it. He was still, in many ways, this kind of very strict Catholic. And I can remember this whole conversation, and he goes, well, how do you succeed in the material realm? He goes, one, the material world, the place we were talking about earlier, is Satan's realm. Tells you very quickly. This is his realm. I don't know why God put him in control of it, but it's his realm. And therefore, if you want to succeed in this realm, you pretty much have to play by his rules. And material success, not the success beyond, okay? If you want to go to heaven, you play by God's rules. If you want to do well here,
Play by his rules.
You play by Satan's rules. Here you suffer. In heaven you are rewarded. If here you benefit, then you suffer later. So this was his view, not mine. But he goes, it's very simple as to how you succeed here. You just sell your soul to the devil. That's all you have to do. There was a again, kind of a shameless plug, but the Secrets of the Occult, which was a course I did for the great courses, and I think in the first episode I said something like, "Are we going to learn how to sell our souls to the devil?" No, we'll get to that. But then by the time you get to the end of it, I go, well, now you know what the answer to that is. It's just very simple. All you have to do is you just have to want to. You don't need a ritual. You don't need to, cut your hand with a magic dagger or anything else. The minute you decide that's what you want to do, you've done it. The offer is always open. Got to believe in the devil first and all the rest of it. But,
For some, that's pretty easy.
You could try it and see what happens. I don't advise that. So, Posey's view was that, people who tend to succeed in the material world have consciously or unconsciously essentially sold their souls to the devil. And that will give you what you want. It's always a Faustian bargain, which means there is always will be paid sooner and more harshly than you expect, but it will be kind of fun for the short term. So, I don't know. That seems a fairly simplistic and highly Catholic answer to the situation, but it is one. It's another kind of narrative. So it certainly is true that you can get, if you're willing to lie, cheat, murder, and steal, and you're able to do that in a clever way that you don't get caught right away, you can achieve material benefits that you would otherwise have to work a lifetime for and possibly never to achieve. There's a way to do that. So it was in a recent podcast that my friend and I did. It's called Strange as It Seems. I have to get that plug in there.
We'll have that link below.
Okay. Then I was talking about, because he and I had talked about it before, when I was a teenager, my friends got together and we played around with the Ouija board. It was a very interesting experience, and most of it was just gobbledygook, but every now and then weird things happened. You'd have to listen to the episode to find most of it. But it was one of the questions for us in that is what exactly was going on, because there was something, we weren't really pushing it, and I don't know. I can't put a clear definition. I know odd things happened. I can't necessarily explain what most of them were. It was, if there is indeed a thing that could be defined as diabolic, that might have had something to do with it. It got kind of creepy after a while. But one of the things is that the Ouija board, the supposed spirit in that, anytime we would ask it how we could make money, because we were like 17 and we really wanted money, especially without working, he would always give us the same answer: rob a bank. Okay, just go rob a bank. It's relatively easy. That's the way that you can get money. So it was no real, that was the quick and dirty way to do things. And that is an approach to life that, Al Capone took that approach, worked pretty well for him for a while, but it never tends to work
forever,
for long.
So if you're, again, like looking at it from just that larger world perspective we've been discussing, and, if you're bringing people in, it's like, and this is kind of one of the first questions I asked is, can an agency, and now if we expand it to an individual or even to the deep state, can they use the occult as a tool? I think that's kind of exactly where the tool comes into play. Maybe you don't believe in it yourself, or maybe you do. But if you can get those around you to either buy in so that in their head they can say, well, what I'm doing is for my own benefit, whether it's stuff that was happening on Epstein Island or whether it's you're trying to convince an asset to give up information, whatever it may be. It's that it's, again, impacting that mindset, getting people to buy in so that you push them in the direction you want them to go. Versus, as your one friend said, if you're living a proper life, you'll never go along with a lot of these darker aspects happening.
Well, again, if magic works, and I am sure intelligence agencies through MK Ultra and things have tried it to figure out if it does. If it did, they wouldn't tell you. And they'd use it.
Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't you use it? It's there. It's just a thing. And that would be true. You know, magic is just a tool. It depends upon what you want to make, what purpose you want to use it for. You can use it to save puppies, or you can use it to drown people, you know, sink ships, whatever you would want to do. It's a matter of the choice that you make. And that's the kind of, you know, maybe that in some ways is, again, from a kind of occult standpoint, is, or an esoteric standpoint, is the degree that we have a control over something, is the choices that we make. So, can you use a Ouija board? We would often ask it questions about what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when am I going to die? Okay, everybody wants it. Yeah, when you're 17, you want to know that. Later on, not so much. and none of the answers, as far as I mean, the people I know, none of those things ever worked out. Okay, in predictions you were getting, like who you're going to take to the prom or something like
Nobody
that.
robbed a bank.
None of this. Nobody robbed that I know of. Never worked out. And at one point, we sort of challenged it by going, well, you tell us these things are going to happen, and none of them ever happen. So, had an interesting explanation for it, which was that, well, what I told you was going to happen was what the trajectory was at that particular moment when you asked the question. Now, having asked the question and been given an answer, now you're aware. This is whole idea that consciousness affects reality, that once you become aware of something, you change it, you alter it. It's like quantum physics.
Mm-hmm.
So once you became aware of it, then, even without thinking about it, you began to make choices and decisions that changed it. So as soon as that result was revealed to you, it's no longer valid. Something else is going to happen. So see, I have covered my ass as the Ouija board. I gave you a prediction that was right at the time, but by knowing about it, your consciousness altered it.
It's not a bad explanation.
Not a bad explanation. Probably a lie, but
I don't know. I mean, again, the idea of it, even at a basic level, let's say there is nothing spiritual behind the scenes. There's no alternate reality. The reality we live in is what science and, like, at the very baseline, what the average thought of it maybe. It's even that mindset change, that the idea is like, yeah, if, you know, the manifesting, if you have confidence, oftentimes you being confident that you can achieve something make you a little bit more.
Well, I think that's something we go, you know, if you think you're going to fail, if you go into something thinking you're going to fail, you will almost certainly fail. I mean, every now and then, surprisingly, you don't, but usually you'll fail. You know, confidence helps, you know, the ability. It doesn't protect you from failure. Sometimes you overreach yourself, but it's better to go into it with confidence, because if you have none, then you'll just get the result that you expected.
So wrapping up, one of the questions I'd love to hear is, for the average individual right now, and I think you said this on like Dalton's podcast, but if there's a deep state, huge, at the end of the day, there's nothing we can really do about it. They're in power. But for some of the more smaller situations happening, how would you say for someone, or what would you be looking for to recognize like a psyop, something being put on by the government?
Well, if you do it right, it shouldn't be that recognizable. You know, it's like a magic trick. If it's performed correctly, how the trick was done shouldn't be apparent. But in terms of when you're being manipulated, beware of a narrative that is pushed very hard and relentlessly by people who present themselves as figures in power. Look closely at ideas that are vociferously attacked. Okay, what is it you were told you're not supposed to believe in? Why is this idea being particularly denounced? So it was a bit. We were talking earlier, and again to bring up Alex Jones. All right, Alex. There are people who I'm an agnostic when it comes to Alex Jones. I mean, I find him kind of entertaining and not necessarily believable, but partly because Alex Jones has become a kind of caricature, whether he intended to or not. And it became, or we were essentially, I think much of the public came to believe that anything he said, because he said it, because it came out of the mouth of Alex Jones, was inherently unbelievable. He was a crazy guy. He was a buffoon. He was spouting nonsense. Therefore, if he then turned around and told you something that was absolutely true, the mere fact that he said it, and thus, knowingly or not, he became a tool in the disinformation game. And disinformation is an important concept because it's very different than misinformation. Misinformation is a mistake. Misinformation is when someone stops and asks you for directions and you realize that you gave them the wrong directions. It was just a mistake. Mistakes happen. Disinformation is deliberate, and it always has one aim: to lead the hounds away from the fox. Disinformation, to be good, must be mostly true. It must have a critical lie, a poison pill, which is embedded in a digestible matrix of truth. It has to pass, because part of what you'll do is you sort of test it, you'll find out that some of the things within this are demonstrably true. And your assumption is that if 9 points out of 10 are true, then the 10th must be as well, but it's not. So disinformation is always intended to mislead, usually to distract. So it doesn't have to be, in fact, most of it probably will be relatable, but something which is pushed very hard by people who tend to pretend to speak or who actually speak from position of authority, in which there's often an idea of kind of retribution or punishment if you don't go along with this. That's a kind of hard sell with a threat behind it. And that you should look twice at, and even 3 times or 4 times. Here's one advice I could give you. It's hard to do. Stop believing in things. Okay? Just don't do it. And by believing in things, again, I mean accepting something on someone's word without any actual proof and then building your life around it, using that as a kind of operative paradigm in some way. My wife accuses me every now and then of being paranoid. Not paranoid. There's kind of pronoid where, things are out to get you. Okay. I mean, that's just the basic reality in life. Everything's trying to kill you. And sooner or later, something will succeed. Okay. So there are things to be afraid of. You have to be cautious. You have to be... The truth is rarely obvious, except when it is. And then you may not notice it as that. It's what is the saying that goes with that? Everything can be, again, it's this idea that words cast spells. Maybe that's part of it. Beware of that fact. Who's the person who's talking to you? Is this person trying to cast a spell over, in the sense of convincing you of something, of selling you some disinformation narrative that is mostly true but includes some kind of critical error? Pay attention to what's being said. Don't be, this is hard. This is like, saying don't be hungry in some way, but restrain the gullibility. Okay. And this is the way they'll get you. The way that they'll get you is that they'll tell you what you already want to believe, or what you already believe. That's how you manipulate someone. You figure out what they already believe and you build your narrative to appeal to that. If you believe in nothing, they cannot do it. Similar to one of my favorite phrases, if no one obeys, no one can rule. I don't know how that would work, but I like that.
It would be.
No one obeys, no one can rule. So think critically. Think about what it is that you're hearing. Don't just respond to it. There's always also the things that try to get an emotional response out of you, to appeal to emotion. That's just the recipe for manipulation.
You should look the other way for something else.
So be cautious. Think critically. Mistrust authority. Because remember, if you didn't specifically vote for them, why are they making decisions for you? Mm-hmm. That's it. That's all the advice I have to have. Good luck.
Well, that's fantastic advice. And Rick, thank you so much for coming on the show today. If you want to let people know where they can obviously find some of your books, but I know we discussed this at breakfast. If you want to let people know, you have a new book coming out here soon, an audiobook that's going through.
I am doing some. So again, you can check out the great courses. I've got a course on secret societies, their video series, one on crimes of the century, secrets of the occult, great villains of history has just come out. And I'm working on, I've just completed episodes for an Audible course through the great courses, but I don't know, they've got a business arrangement. They can figure that out. It's called, or the working title is UFOs and the Cold War. And it's essentially my take in looking at a variety of UFO cases, famous and not so famous, from Roswell all the way up to the Gulf Breeze 6, and looking at it from the standpoint is that, well, okay, there might be aliens here, but if it's not aliens, then what is it? And you know what tends to show up a lot? The CIA. You think the Air Force, but the CIA is, and there's, and that is a perfect case of the manipulation of information. Well, if you're interested, check out UFOs in the Cold War when it comes out, and hopefully it'll make sense then.
Like I said, all those links will be below. And like I was saying at breakfast today, too, as soon as that comes out, we got to jump back on the line because I'm be excited to talk about that. I know people listening, they're going to be jumping all over that course because that's probably two of the favorite topics that pop up on the podcast, okay. Cold War and, of course, UFOs. So, looking forward to that. And thank you again so much for coming out today.
Well, thanks for having me.